Hello, hello, hello. Hey, Nudes, good to see you. I hopped into your stream earlier. Um, I love that game. I played the heck out of it when it came out. I love it so much. Hello, hello. Happy Thursday. How we all doing today? There is a crane right outside my window. The people above me are doing something. So I might have somebody occasionally like peeking into my window. I guess I could have closed it before I sat down, but it's fine. Hey, Falcor. Hello, hello. Also, it's like super cloudy and supposed to snow today and tomorrow, so it's a chamomile tea type of a mood right now. Oh, I love the enthusiasm. Yeah, we'll see, we'll see. So if I'm like looking up off into the distance, we'll pretend that I'm just being super contemplative and thinking wonderful thoughts, but it's probably just the crane moving and catching my attention. But yes, how are we doing today? What did I do today? I don't know. It's one of those days that wistful crane feels. Exactly, exactly. Hmm. It's one of those days where I feel like I was busy like the whole day, but I don't think I can tell you what I did. I don't. I don't think I can tell you. I know that I made a grocery list because I did that right before coming on stream, but I don't know what else I've been doing. I don't know. I can't tell you. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. That's fine. I pretend like I'm gonna have a sip every 2 seconds, but it is too stinking hot, and I'm just gonna burn my face off and melt every organ that I have. So we're just gonna hold off on that. All right. Reading updates. Please don't take fire damage. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Today I read volume 6 of Yol. I learned that I was saying this wrong. I was saying it with my American Chicago accent. It's Yotsuba, and I've been saying it Yatsuba because that's just how O's are supposed to be pronounced.
Moog slide chan 37 chaplain Moog slide chan 37 chaplain Moog slide.
Wadsworth! Thank you so much for the resub. 8 months. Amazing. Amazing. And I love when the bot says what the what the emotes are. It's so great. Thank you so much for sticking around. You're having an ADHD day. Yes, your brain is all over the place and you may not make thoughtful comments. That's fine. We can't always. You were extremely thoughtful on Tuesday. I feel like you've made up for it. Okay. Yes, I read volume 6 of Yotsuba today. It's super cute. Let's see. What else? I don't know. I started that science fiction book that I was talking about on Tuesday, Chance. I just read the like prequel, which is like I don't know what's going on, basically. But I've only read the prequel, or not the prequel, the forward. So we'll see. We'll see. You have to share. Okay. I say this with the admiration and respect. Thank you, Noodles. I actually wore this to be Shy Guy for Halloween one year. Thank you. But yeah, with the hair in addition to this, oh, you're totally right. You're totally right. They're closing your physical location forever today. Wadsworth. That's so insane. That's a huge change. So then, I mean, I'm guessing you're just gonna be work from home all the time? That's wild. Are you like your position and your department? Do you like rely on being in person and having like that physical space? Oh, Noodles, it's so cute. So exciting. Oh, you haven't been going in much after even after the reopening. Yeah, okay. That's fun. I'm sure it's a good thing. But yeah, like that's a huge change. Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-mm-mm. It's been home base for over 10 years. Yeah. Wild. Wild. I'm sure it makes sense for a lot of businesses to do that just because everybody has proven that they can work from home and still like communicate regularly and effectively. But yeah, like that's huge. The pile of ancient swag. It's like a time capsule. That's great. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I guess I just don't really have that many updates this this day. I don't think so. Oh, go get your laundry. Go. It's been a roller coaster. Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah, because even if you're not going in all the time, like you know it's there. Like that is your work, you know? Mm-hmm. Comcast had been working on enhancing the lines in your area for the last couple of days. They claim that they're done. So excited for these enhancements. Oh, Comcast. Well, I hope that you don't experience any of these enhancements in a negative way. We'll see. We'll see. Mm, Crane. Well, and it doesn't help that the crane, so that the crane right outside, it's bright green. That doesn't help at all. I should have closed the window. It's fine. I'm guessing that they'll be done working soon. We'll see. We'll find out. All right. Let's. December and January were nightmares for internet. Oh no. He wound up finally running a new line to the house. And okay. Well, that's good. That's good. That sucks that for 2 months it's been terrible, though. Wadsworth, thank you so much for contributing to April's Sunday stream. I'll be playing Monkey Island again. I feel like it's supposed to be a 6-hour game. And I feel like I just started the game. There may or may not be a cosplay involved again on that day, but we'll see. Yeah, fingers crossed. Absolutely. Absolutely, Pam. Yay! Oh, that's so exciting. That's so exciting. I love that. They're just like reading streams are just so calming and like you can just like have it on in the background and just like doing whatever, but like having that like voice or that friend or like whoever just like in the background can be like super nice, or just like snuggling in and just having like an adult story time is always super fun too. You have no idea what you're going to read after you finish The Hobbit. Yes. And Lord of the Rings. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But you got time. Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, RPGs and storytelling and reading just like that like creativity and immersion has always been super interesting for sure. Oh, yeah. Mm. All right, Vera. What to say about Vera? Today we're starting on chapter 19. We are 53% of the way through. So we still got a good chunk going. And I worry. So, recapping what has happened. This is a very high level recap, just because we are more than 50% of the way through. But it is about these two people, Lucy and Everard Weems, who have bonded through their shared trauma. So Lucy lost her dad and Weems lost his wife. However, there is a lot of questions behind Weems's wife Vera's death. Whether it was an accident, whether it was on purpose, lots of questions, lots of speculations that we as readers also do not have the insight for. Um, Weems has wiggled his way into Lucy's life, and Lucy is much, much younger than Weems. Weems is in his 40s, and Lucy is 22, I think. And there's a lot of description and language used that it when Weems is like thinking about Lucy and like how young she is and how much of a child she is and things like that. So like that adds another like layer of creepy. But they did get married, much to everybody's dismay, and they went on their honeymoon, and on their honeymoon, Lucy is seeing different things that Weems didn't show. Like he doesn't let people into his planning. He will plan something and then he will let other people into the plans that he has dictated. And if it's a no or if it's a not immediate yes to anything that he says or anything that he has planned, then he gets like turned off and like reclusive and doesn't like silent treatment type deal and is super moody. And they have just now gotten back to Weems's house, which is the very house where Vera died, and nothing has been changed in the house. So Lucy has had some sort of apprehension to going there because Lucy's going to be in the same rooms that Vera was in and all of these other things, and just feeling a little uneasy as a normal person would. And yeah. We're about to go on a tour actually of the house. So they just had their lunch and they just had tea, and Weems is making a lot of comments about the windows, which is how Vera has died, was by falling or tripping or jumping out of a window. So we'll see. Yes, exactly. Being in the same bed, laying in the same spot as Vera, and nothing has changed. And also, there's a huge, massive portrait of Vera, a life-size portrait of Vera in the dining room that just like stares at you. So, we'll see. But yeah, Weems is much more quick to anger if things don't go his way and is very vocal in reprimanding his help around the house, which is they're all red flags. Everything that has ever happened from Weems is a red flag. And Lucy is by result has started to already make herself smaller. They've only been married for a month, I think, a little bit less. So if the, if the eyes on the portrait move, I'm out. A totally different book. Or maybe this book, I don't know. I don't know. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 19. The wind made more noise than ever at the top of the house, and when Weems tried to open the door to Vera's sitting room, it blew back on him. Well, I'll be damned, he said, giving it a great shove. Why? asked Lucy nervously. Come in, he said impatiently, pressing the door open and pulling her through. There was a great flapping of blinds and rattling of blind cords, a whirl of sheets of note paper, an extra wild shriek of the wind, and then Weems, hanging on to the door, shut it, and the room quieted down. That slattern Lizzie, he exclaimed, striding across to the fireplace and putting his finger on the bell button and keeping it there. What has she done? Asked Lucy, standing where he had just left her, inside the door. Done? Can't you see? You mean, she could hardly get herself to mention the fatal thing. You mean the window? On a day like this. He continued to press the bell. It was a very loud bell, for it rang upstairs as well as down, in order to be sure of catching Lizzie's ear in whatever part of the house she might be endeavoring to evade it, and Lucy, as she listened to its strident, persistent summons of a Lizzie who didn't appear, felt more and more on edge, felt at last that to listen and wait any longer was unbearable. "Won't you wear it out?" she asked, after some moments of nothing happening and Weems still ringing. He didn't answer. He didn't look at her. His finger remained steadily on the button. His face was extraordinarily like the old man's in the enlarged photograph downstairs. That's right, he also has a life-size portrait of his father, and it looks just like Weems, but a little bit older. And also creepy. Lucy wished for only two things at that moment. One was that Lizzie shouldn't come, and the other was that if she did, she herself might be allowed to go and be somewhere else. Hadn't hadn't the window better be shut? She suggested timidly presently, while he still went on ringing and saying nothing. Else, when Lizzie opens the door, won't all the things blow about again? He didn't answer, and went on ringing. Of all the objects in the world that she could think of, Lucy most dreaded and shrank from that window. Nevertheless, she began to feel that as Everard was engaged with the bell and apparently wouldn't leave it, it behooved her to put into practice her resolution not to be a fool, but to be direct and wholesome, and go and shut it herself. There it was, the fatal window, huge as the one in the bedroom below, and the one in the library below that, yawning wide open above its murderous low sill, with the rain flying in on every fresh gust of wind and wetting the floor and the cushions of the sofa, and even, as she could see, those sheets of notepaper off the writing table that had flown in her face when she came in and were now lying scattered at her feet. Surely the right thing to do was to shut the window before Lizzie opened the door and caused a second convulsion. Everard couldn't, because he was ringing the bell. She could, and she would. Yes, she would do the right thing, and at the same time be both simple and courageous. "I'll shut it," she said, taking a step forward. She was arrested by Weems's voice. "Confound it!" he cried. "Can't you leave it alone?" She stopped dead. He had never spoken to her like that before. She had never heard that voice before. It seemed to hit her straight to the heart. "Don't interfere," he said very loudly. She was frozen where she stood. "Tiresome woman," he said, still ringing. She looked at him. He was looking at her. "Who?" she breathed. "You." Her heart seemed to stop beating. She gave a little gasp, and turned her head to right and left like something trapped, something searching for escape. Everard. Where was her Everard? Why didn't he come and take care of her? Come and take her away, out of that room, out of that room. Hello, Gentle Fox. Yes, it is extremely toxic relationship. Lots and lots of red flags, and is just as important to talk about today, for sure. Oof. But yes, good question. There were sounds of steps hurrying along the passage, and then there was a great scream of the wind, and a great whirl of the notepaper, and a great blowing up on end off her forehead of her short hair. And Lizzie was there, panting, on the threshold. "I'm sorry, sir," she panted, her hand on her chest. "I was changing my dress." "Shut the door, can't you?" cried Weems, about whose ears, too, notepaper and flying. "Hold on to it. Don't let it go. Damn you!" "Oh, oh," gasped Lucy, stretching out her hands as though to keep something off. "I think I I think I'll go downstairs." But before Weems realized what she was doing, she had turned and slipped through the door Lizzie was struggling with, and was gone. "Lucy!" he shouted. "Lucy, come back at once!" But the wind was too much for Lizzie, and the door dragged itself out of her hands and crashed to. As though the devil were after her, Lucy ran along the passage. Down the stairs she flew, down past the bedroom landing, down past the going landing, down into the hall, and across it to the front door, and tried to pull it open, and found it was bolted, and tugged at the bolts, tugged frantically, getting them undone at last, and rushing out onto the steps. There an immense gust of rain caught her full in the face. Splash! Bang! She was sobered. The rain splashed on her as though a bucket were being emptied at her, and the door had banged about her, shutting her out. Suddenly horrified at herself, she turned quickly, as frantic to get in again as she had been to get out. What was she doing? Where was she running to? She must get in, before Everard could come after her, before he could find her standing there like a drenched dog outside his front door. The wind whipped her wet hair across her eyes. Where was the handle? She couldn't find it. Her hair wouldn't keep out of her eyes. Her thin serge skirt blew up like a balloon and got in the way of her trembling fingers searching along the door. She must get in, before he came. What had possessed her? Everard. He couldn't have meant. He didn't mean. What would he think? What would he think? Oh, where was that handle? Then she heard heavy footsteps on the other side of the door, and Weems's voice, still very loud, saying to somebody he had got with him, "Haven't I given strict orders that this door is to be kept bolted?" And then the sound of bolts being shot. "Everard! Everard!" Lucy cried, beating on the door with both hands. "I'm here! Out here! Let me in! Everard!" But he evidently heard nothing, for his footsteps went away again. Snatching her hair out of her eyes, she looked out for the bell and reached up for it and pulled it violently. What she had done was terrible. She must get in at once, face the parlor-maid's astonishment, run to Everard. She couldn't imagine his thoughts. Where did he suppose she was? He must be searching the house for her. He would be dreadfully upset. Why didn't the parlor-maid come? Was she changing her dress too? No. She had waited at lunch already in her black afternoon clothes. Then why didn't she come? Lucy pulled the bell again and again, at last keeping it down, using up its electricity as squanderously as Weems had used it upstairs. She was wet to the skin by this time, and you wouldn't have recognized her pretty hair, all dark now and sticking together in lank strands. Everard. Why, of course, Everard had only spoken like that out of fear. Fear and love. The window. Of course he would be terrified lest she, too, trying to shut that fatal window, that heavy, great, fatal window, should slip. Oh, of course, of course. How could she have misunderstood? In moments of danger, of dreadful anxiety for one's heart's beloved, one did speak sharply, one did rap out commands. It was because he loved her so much. Oh, how lunatic of her to have misunderstood. At last she heard someone coming, and she let go of the bell and braced herself to meet the astonished gaze of the parlor-maid with as much dignity as was possible in one who only too well knew she must be looking like a drowning cat. But the footsteps grew heavy as they got nearer, and it was Weems who, After pulling back the bolts, opened the door. "Oh, Everard!" Lucy exclaimed, running in, pursued to the last by the pelting rain. "I'm so glad it's you. Oh, I'm so sorry. Her voice died away. She had seen his face. He stooped to bolt the lower bolt. "Don't be angry, darling Everard," she whispered, laying her arm on his stooping shoulder. Having finished with the bolt, Weems straightened himself, and then, putting up his hand to the arm still round his shoulder, he removed it. "You'll make my coat wet," he said, and walked away to the library door and went in and shut it. For a moment she stood where he had left her, collecting her scattered senses. Then she went after him, wet or not wet, soaked and dripping as she was, ridiculous scarecrow with her clinging clothes, her lank hair. She must go after him, must instantly get the horror of misunderstanding straight, tell him how she had meant only to help over that window, tell him how she had thought he was saying dreadful things to her when he was really only afraid for her safety. Tell him how silly she had been. Silly. Silly not to have followed his thoughts quicker. Tell him he must forgive her, be patient with her, help her, because she loved him so much, and she knew, oh, she knew how much he loved her. Across the hall ran Lucy, the whole of her one welter of anxious penitence and longing and love, and when she got to the door and turned the handle, it was locked. He had locked her out. End of chapter 19. Also, hello, Gentle Fox. I didn't even say hi. Hello, how are you? Happy Thursday. Chapter 19. Just leave. Yeah, yeah. Come on, Lucy. Wake up. Yeah. So he, they were going into the dressing room. The window was open, so everything was flying all over the place. He's already yes, yes. Thank you so much for the follow. Hello, hi, welcome in. Happy Thursday. Yeah, and like Lucy is just trying to make things better so that a bigger explosion doesn't happen. Yes, yes, only 1 month. They got married the first Saturday of March, and then they got like this is the first day that they're in the house, and it's April 4th. So, yeah, 1 month, and he's already yelling at her and locking her out of the house. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's already walking on eggshells to try and soothe the temper tantrums. All right. Chapter 20. Her hand slid slowly off the knob. She stood quite still. How could he? And she knew now that he had bolted the front door knowing she was out in the rain. How could he? Her body was motionless as she stood staring at the locked door, but her brain was a rushing confusion of questions. Why? Why? This couldn't be Everard. Who was this man? Pitiless, cruel. Not Everard. Not her lover. Where was he? Her lover and husband. Why didn't he come and take care of her and not let her be frightened by this strange man? She heard a chair being moved inside the room, and then she heard the creak of leather as Weems sat down in it, and then there was the rustle of a newspaper being opened. He was actually settling down to read a newspaper, while she, his wife, his love, wasn't he always telling her that she was his little love? Was breaking her heart outside the locked door. Why, but Everard. She and Everard, they understood each other. They had laughed, played together, talked nonsense, been friends. For an instant, she had an impulse to cry out and beat on the door, not to care who heard, not to care that the whole house should come and gather round her naked misery, but she was stopped by a sudden new wisdom. It shuddered down on her heart, a wisdom she had never known or needed before, and held her quiet. At all costs, there mustn't be two of them doing these things. At all cost, these things mustn't be doubled, mustn't have echoes. If Everard was like this, he must be like it alone. She must wait. She must sit quiet till he had finished. Else, but oh, he couldn't be like it. It couldn't be true that he didn't love her. Yet, if he did love her, how could he? How could he? She leaned her forehead against the door and began softly to cry. Then, afraid that she might, after all, burst out into loud, disgraceful sobbing, she turned and went upstairs. But where could she go? Where in the whole house was any refuge, any comfort? The only person who could have told her anything, who could have explained, who knew, was Vera. Yes, she would have understood. Yes, Vera. She would go to Vera's room, get as close to her mind as she could, search, find something, some clue. It seemed now to Lucy, as she hurried upstairs, that the room in the house she had most shrunk from was the one place where she might hope to find comfort. Oh, she wasn't frightened anymore. Everything was trying to frighten her, but she wasn't going to be frightened. For some reason or other, things were all trying together today to see if they could crush her, beat out her spirit. But they weren't going to. She jerked her wet hair out of her eyes as she climbed the stairs. It kept on getting into them and making her stumble. Vera would help her. Vera never was beaten. Vera had had 15 years of not being beaten before she had that accident. And there must have been heaps of days just like this one, with the wind screaming and Vera up in her room and Everard down in his, locked in, perhaps, and yet Vera had managed, and her spirit wasn't beaten out. For years and years, panted Lucy, her very thoughts came in gasps. Vera lived up here winter after winter, years, and would have been here now if she hadn't. Oh, if only Vera weren't dead. If only Vera weren't dead. But her mind lived on. Her mind was in that room, in every slightest thing in it. Lucy stumbled up the last few stairs completely out of breath, and opening the sitting room door, stood panting on the threshold much as Lizzie had done, her hand on her chest. This time everything was in order. The window was shut, the scattered notepaper collected and tidily on the writing table, the rain on the floor wiped up, and a fire had been lit, and the wet cushions were drying in front of it. Also there was Lizzie, engaged in conscience-stricken activities, and when Lucy came in, she was on her knees poking the fire. She was poking so vigorously that she didn't hear the door open, especially not with that rattling and banging of the window going on, and on getting up and seeing the figure standing there panting, with strands of lank hair in its eyes and its general air of neglect and weather, she gave a loud exclamation. "Lume!" exclaimed Lizzie, whose origin and bringing up had been obscure. She had helped carry in the luggage that morning, so she had seen her mistress before and knew what she was like in her dry state. She never could have believed, having seen her then all nicely fluffed out, that there was so little of her. Lizzie knew what long-haired dogs looked like when they were being soaped, and she was also familiar with cats as they appear after drowning. Yet they too surprised her, in spite of familiarity, each time she saw them in these circumstances, by their want of real substance, of stuffing. Her mistress looked just like that, no stuffing at all, and therefore Lizzie, the poker she was holding arrested in mid-air on its way into its corner, exclaimed, Then, realizing that this weather-beaten figure must certainly be catching its death of cold, she dropped the poker and, hurrying across the room and talking in the stress of the moment like one girl to another, she felt Lucy's sleeve and said, "Why, you're wet to the bones. Come to the fire and take them sopping clothes off this minute, or you'll be laid up as sure as sure." "Hey, Star, hello, welcome in," and pulled her over to the fire, and having got her there, and she saying nothing at all and not resisting, Lizzie stripped off her clothes and shoes and stockings, repeating at frequent intervals as she did so, "Dear, dear," and repressing a strong desire to beg her not to take on, lest later, perhaps, her mistress mightn't like her to have noticed she had been crying. Then she snatched up a woolen coverlet that lay folded on the end of the sofa, rolled her tightly round in it, sat her in a chair right up close to the fender, and still talking like one girl to another, said, "Now sit there and don't move while I fetch dry things. I won't be above a minute. Now you promise, don't you?" And hurrying to the door, never remembered her manners at all till she was through it, whereupon she put her head again and hastily said, "Mum," and disappeared. Oh, Falcor, Star, thank you so much for contributing to Sunday's stream. She was away, however, more than a minute. 5 minutes. 10 minutes passed, and Lizzie, feverishly unpacking Lucy's clothes in the bedroom below, and trying to find a complete set of them, and not knowing what belonged to which, didn't come back. Lucy lay quite still, rolled up in Vera's coverlet. Obediently, she didn't move, but stared straight into the fire, sitting so close up to it that the rest of the room was shut out. She couldn't see the window, or the dismal rain streaming down it. She saw nothing but the fire, blazing cheerfully. How kind Lizzie was. How comforting kindness was. It was a thing she understood, a normal, natural thing, and it made her feel normal and natural just to be with it. Lizzie had given her such a vigorous rub-down that her skin tingled. Her hair was on ends, for that too had had a vigorous rubbing from Lizzie, who had taken her apron to it, feeling that this was an occasion on which one abandoned convention and went in for resource. And as Lucy sat there, getting warmer and warmer and more pervaded by the feelings of relief and well-being that even the most wretched feel if they take off all their clothes, her mind gradually calmed down. It left off asking agonized questions, and presently her heart began to do the talking. She was so much accustomed to find life kind, that given a moment of quiet like this, with somebody being good-natured, and back she slipped to her usual state, which was one of affection and confidence. Lizzie hadn't been gone 5 minutes before Lucy had passed from sheer bewildered misery to making excuses for Everard. In 10 minutes, she was seeing good reasons for what he had done. In 15, she was blaming herself for most of what had happened. She had been amazingly idiotic to run out of the room, and surely quite mad to run out of the house. It was wrong, of course, for him to bolt her out, but he was angry, and people did things when they were angry that horrified them afterwards. Surely, people who easily got angry needed all the sympathy and understanding one could give them, not to be met by despair and loss of faith in them of the person they had hurt. They only turned passing, temporary bad things into a long unhappiness. She hadn't known he had a temper. She had only, so far, discovered his extraordinary capacity for being offended. Well, if he had a temper, how could he help it? He was born that way, as certainly as if he had been born lame. Would she not have been filled with tenderness for his lameness if she had happened to be born like that? Would it ever have occurred to her mind to feel it as a grievance? The warmer Lucy got, the more eager she grew to justify Weems. In the middle of the reasons she was advancing for his justification, however, it suddenly struck her that they were a little smug. All that about people with tempers needing sympathy. Who was she, with her impulses and impatience? With her, as she now saw, devastating impulses and impatiences, to take a line of what was very like pity. Pity. Smug, odious word. smug, odious thing. Wouldn't she hate it if she thought he pitied her for her failings? Let him be angry with her failings, but not pity her. She and her man, they needed no pity from each other. They had love. It was impossible that anything either of them did or was should really touch that. Very warm now in Vera's blanket, her face flushed by the fire, Lucy asked herself what could really put out that great, glorious central blaze. All that was needed was patience when she gave herself a shake. There she was again, thinking smugly. She wouldn't think at all. She would just take things as they came and love and love. Then the vision of Everard, sitting solitary with his newspaper, and by this time, too, probably thinking only of love and anyhow not happy, caused one of those very impulses to lay hold of her which she had a moment before been telling herself she would never give way to again. She was aware one had gripped her, but this was a good impulse. This wasn't a bad one, like running out into the rain. She would go down and have another try at that door. She was warmed through now and quite reasonable, and she felt she couldn't another minute endure not being at peace with Everard. How silly they were. It was ridiculous. It was like two children fighting. Lizzie was so long bringing her clothes, she couldn't wait. She must sit on Everard's knee again, feel his arms round her, see his eyes looking kind. She would go down in her blanket. It wrapped her up from top to toe. Only her feet were bare, but they were quite warm, and anyhow, feet didn't matter. So Lucy padded softly downstairs, making hardly a sound, and certainly none that could be heard above the noise of the wind by Lizzie in the bedroom, frantically throwing clothes about. She knocked at the library door. Weems's voice said, "Come in." So he had unlocked it. So he had hoped she would come. He didn't, however, look round. He was sitting with his back to the door at the writing table in the window, writing. "I want my flowers in here," he said, without turning his head. So he had rung. So he thought it was the parlor maid. So he hadn't unlocked the door because he hoped she would come. But his flowers, he wanted his birthday flowers in there because they were all that were left to him of his ruined birthday. When she heard this order, Lucy's heart rushed out to him. She shut the door swiftly, and with her bare feet, making no sound, went up behind him. He thought the parlor maid had shut the door and gone to carry out his order. Feeling an arm put round his shoulder, he thought the parlor maid hadn't gone to carry out his order, but had gone mad instead. "Good God!" he exclaimed, jumping up. At the sight of Lucy in her blanket with her bare feet and her confused hair, his face changed. He stared at her without speaking. I've come to tell you, she began. Then she faltered, for his mouth was a mere hard line. "Everard, darling," she said, entreatingly, lifting her face to his. "Let's be friends. Please, let's be friends. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." His eyes ran over her. It was evident that all she had on was that blanket. A strange fury came into his face, and he turned his back on her and marched with a heavy tread to the door, a tread that made Lucy, for some reason she couldn't at first understand, think of Elgar. "Why Elgar?" part of her asked, puzzled, while the rest of her was blankly watching Weems. Of course, the march, pomp and circumstance. At the door he turned and said, "Since you thrust yourself into my room when I have shown you I don't desire your company, you force me to leave it." Then he added, his voice sounding weird and through his teeth, "You'd better go and put your clothes on. I assure you I'm proof against sexual allurements." Then he went out. Lucy stood looking at the door. Sexual allurements? What did he mean? Did he mean? She flushed suddenly, and gripping her blanket tight about her, she too marched to the door, her eyes bright and fixed. Considering the blanket, she walked upstairs with a good deal of dignity and past the bedroom door just as Lizzie, Her arms full of a complete set of clothing came out. "Lume!" once more exclaimed Lizzie, who seemed marked down for shocks, and dropped a hairbrush and a shoe. Disregarding her, Lucy proceeded up the next flight with the same dignity, and having reached Vera's room, crossed to the fire, where she stood in silence while Lizzie, who had hurried after her and was reproaching her for having gone downstairs like that, dressed her and brushed her hair. She was quite silent. She didn't move. She was miles away from Lizzie, absorbed in quite a new set of astonished, painful thoughts. But at the end, when Lizzie asked her if there was anything more she could do, she looked at her a minute, and then, having realized her, put out her hand and laid it on her arm. "Thank you very much for everything," she said earnestly. "I'm terribly sorry about that window, Mum," said Lizzie, who was sure she had been the cause of trouble. "I don't know what came over me to forget it." Lucy smiled faintly at her. "Never mind," she said, and she thought that if it hadn't been for that window, she and Everard, well, it was no use thinking like that. Perhaps there would have been something else. Lizzie went. She was a recent acquisition, and was the only one of the servants who hadn't known the late Mrs. Weems, but she told herself that anyhow, she preferred this one. She went, and Lizzie stood where she had left her, staring at the floor, dropping back into her quite new set of astonished, painful thoughts. Everard. That was an outrage. That about sexual allurements. Just simply an outrage. She flushed at the remembrance of it. Her whole body seemed to flush hot. She felt as though never again would she be able to bear him making love to her. He had spoilt that. But that was a dreadful way to feel. That was destructive of the very heart of marriage. No, she mustn't let herself. She must stamp that feeling out. She must forget what he had said. He couldn't really have meant it. He was still in a temper. She oughtn't to have gone down. But how could she know? All this was new to her, a new side of Everard. Perhaps, she thought, watching the reflection of the flames flickering on the shiny, slippery oak floor, only people with tempers should marry people with tempers. They would understand each other, say the same sorts of things, tossing them backwards and forwards like a fiery, hissing ball, know the exact time it would last, and be saved by their vivid emotions from the deadly hurt, the deadly loneliness of the one who couldn't get into a rage. Loneliness. She lifted her head and looked round the room. No, she wasn't lonely. There was still... Suddenly, she went to the bookshelves and began pulling out the books quickly, hungrily reading their names, turning over their pages in a kind of starving hurry to get to know, to get to understand Vera. End of chapter 20. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Lucy, Lucy, Lucy. Just explaining things away and thinking that maybe it was her fault and she did the wrong thing. Chapter 20. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, Lucy. It's not you, Lucy. It's Weems. And it is interesting that Lizzie is the newest hire and didn't know Vera. I'm wondering how much interaction Lucy is going to have with the other, like, parlor maids and such. If, and, like, how that reaction is going to be. And, like, if they get, like, if they give little snippets of what Vera sort of went into. You want her to get really obsessed with Vera. Yeah. Yeah. I think she will. That's what it's sounding like. And, I mean, we'll see. Because, yeah, like, right now she's looking to see, like, how their relationship was, and because clearly it wasn't terrible or abusive because they were married for so long. But did Weems hire her as another firewall with Lucy? Ooh, that's interesting. I like that idea. I like that idea. Weems shakes fist. All right. Chapter 21. We're 59% of the way through. Ooh, that's totally a good point, Noodles. Yes, he doesn't want her to be around the servants who knew Vera because of the information that they could give her. That's super interesting. Yeah, that has to be it. That has to be it. And another way of like isolating. All right. Chapter 21. Meanwhile, Weems had gone into the drawing room till such time as his wife should choose to allow him to have his own library to himself. For a long while he walked up and down it, thinking bitter things, for he was very angry. The drawing room was a big, gaunt room, rarely used of recent years. In the early days, when people called on the newly arrived Weemses, there had been gatherings in it, retaliatory festivities to the vicar, to the doctor, to the landlord, with a business acquaintance or two of Weems's, wife appended, added to fill out. These festivities somehow died of inanition. Yeah, it is interesting that he didn't just completely clean house. And another good point, he is very stuck in his ways, like with the birthday thing, like having those specific flowers at this place and having the gong rung for exactly 2.5 minutes or a minute and a half. I don't remember. I just remember it being ridiculously long, even if they are gathered. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Even if Vera did kill herself, I could see Weems convincing himself it wasn't his fault. Yes. Yes. Something was wanting, something necessary to nourish life in them. He thought of them as he walked about the echoing room from which the last guest had departed years ago. Vera, of course. Her fault that the parties had left off. She had been so slack, so indifferent. You couldn't expect people to come to your house if you took no pains to get them there. Yet, what a fine room for entertaining. The grand piano, too. Never used. And Vera would make such a fuss about music, and pretended she knew all about it. The piano was clothed from head to foot in a heavy red baize cover, even its legs being buttoned round in what looked like alpine sport gaiters, and the baize flap that protected the keys had buttons all along it from one end to the other. In order to play, these buttons had first to be undone. Weems wasn't going to have the expensive piano not taken care of. It had been his wedding present to Vera. How he had loved that woman. And he had had the cloths made specially, and had instructed Vera that whenever the piano was not in use, it was to have them on, properly fastened. What trouble she had had with her, what trouble he had had with her at first time about. She was always forgetting to button it up again. She would be playing and get up and go away to lunch or tea or out into the garden and leave it uncovered with the damp and dust getting into it, and not only uncovered, but with its lid open. Then, when she found that he went in to see if she had remembered, she did for a time cover it up in the intervals of playing, but never buttoned all its buttons. Invariably, he found that some had been forgotten. It had cost him £150. Women had no sense of property. They were unfit to have the charge of valuables. Besides, they got tired of them. Hey, Atkinson, enjoy your lurk. Vera had actually quite soon got tired of the piano, his present. That wasn't very lovely of her. and when he said anything about it, she wouldn't speak. Sulked. How profoundly he disliked sulking. And she, who had made such a fuss about music when first he met her, gave up playing, and for years no one had touched the piano. Well, at least it was being taken care of. From habit, he stooped and ran his eyes up its gaiters. All buttoned. Stay. No. One buttonhole gaped. He stooped closer and put out his hand to button it and found the button gone. No button. Only an end of thread. How was that? He straightened himself and went to the fireplace and rang the bell. Then he waited, looking at his watch. Long ago he had timed the distances between the different rooms and the servants' quarters, allowing for average walking and 1 minute's margin for getting underway at the start, so that he knew exactly at what moment the parlor-maid ought to appear. She appeared just as time was up and his fingers were moving towards the bell again. "Look at that piano leg," said Weems. The parlor-maid, not knowing which leg, looked at all three, so as to be safe. "What do you see?" he asked. The parlor-maid was reluctant to say. What she saw was piano legs, but she felt that wasn't the right answer. "What do you not see?" Weems asked louder. This was much more difficult, because there were so many things she didn't see. Her parents, for instance. "Are you deaf, woman?" he inquired. She knew the answer to that, and said it quickly. "No, sir," she said. "Look at that piano leg, I say." And Weems pointed with his pipe. It was, so to speak, the off foreleg at which he pointed, and the parlor-maid, relieved to be given a clue, fixed her eyes on it eagerly. "What do you see?" he said. "Or rather, what do you not see?" The parlor-maid looked hard at what she saw, leaving what she didn't see to take care of itself. It seemed unreasonable to be asked to look at what she didn't see. But though she looked, she could see nothing to justify speech. Therefore, she was silent. "Don't you see there's a button off?" The parlor-maid, on looking closer, did see that, and said so. "Isn't it your business to attend to this room?" She admitted that it was. "Buttons don't come off of themselves," Weems informed her. The parlor-maid, this was not being a question, said nothing. "Do they?" he asked loudly. "No, sir," said the parlor-maid, though she could have told him many a story of things buttons did do of themselves, coming off in your hand when you hadn't so much as begun to touch them. Cups, too, the way cups would fall apart in one's hands. However, she merely said, "No, sir." "Only wear and tear makes them come off," Weems announced, and continuing judiciously, emphasizing his words with a raised forefinger, he said, "Now attend to me. This piano hasn't been used for years. Do you hear that? Not for years. To my certain knowledge, not for years. Therefore, the cover cannot have been unbuttoned legitimately. It cannot have been unbuttoned by anyone authorized to unbutton it. Therefore," he pointed his finger straight at her and paused. "Do you follow me?" he asked sternly. The parlor-maid hastily reassembled her wandering thoughts. "Yes, sir," she said. "Therefore, someone unauthorized has unbuttoned the cover, and someone unauthorized had played on the piano. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," said the parlor-maid. "It is hardly credible," he went on, "but nevertheless the conclusion can't be escaped, that someone has actually taken advantage of my absence to play that piano. Someone in this house has actually dared—" "There's the tuner," said the parlor-maid tentatively, not sure if that would be an explanation, for Weems's lucid sentence, almost of a legal lucidity, invariably confused her, but giving the suggestion for what it was worth. "I understand the orders was to let the tuner in once a quarter, sir. Yesterday was his day. He played for an hour, and had the bass and everything off, and the lid leaning against the wall." The scene is torture. Mm-hmm. True, true. The tuner. Weems had forgotten the tuner. The tuner had standing instructions to come and tune. Well, they couldn't. Well, why couldn't the fool woman have reminded him sooner? But the tuner having tuned it didn't excuse the parlor-maid's not having sewn on the button the tuner had pulled off. He told her so. Yes, sir, she said. You will have that button on in 5 minutes, he said, pulling out his watch. In 5 minutes exactly from now, that button will be on. I shall be staying in this room, so shall see for myself that you carry out my orders. Yes, sir, said the parlor-maid. He walked to the window and stood staring at the wild afternoon. She remained motionless where she was. What a birthday he was having, and with what joy he had looked forward to it. It seemed to him very like the old birthdays with Vera, only so much more painful because he had expected so much. Vera had got him used to expecting very little, but it was Lucy, his adored Lucy, who was inflicting this cruel disappointment on him. Lucy! Incredible. And she to come down in that blanket, tempting him, very nearly getting him that way rather than by the only right and decent way of sincere and obvious penitence. Why, even Vera had never done a thing like that, not once in all the years. Let's be friends, said Lucy. Friends. Yes, she did say something about sorry, but what about that blanket? Sorrow with no clothes on couldn't possibly be genuine. It didn't go together with that kind of appeal. It was not the sort of combination one expected in a wife. Why couldn't she come down and apologize properly dressed? God, her little shoulder sticking out. How he had wanted to seize and kiss it. But then that would have been giving in. That would have meant her triumph. Her triumph, indeed, when it was she, and she only, who had begun the whole thing, running out of the room like that, not obeying him when he called, humiliating him before that damned Lizzie. He thrust his hands into his pockets and turned away with a jerk from the window. There, standing motionless, was the parlor-maid. What, are you still here? He exclaimed. Why the devil don't you go and fetch that button? I understood your orders was none of us to leave rooms without your permission, sir. You'd better be quick, then, he said, looking at his watch. I gave you 5 minutes, and 3 of them have gone. She disappeared, and in the servants' sitting room, while she was hastily searching for her thimble and a button that would approximately do, she told the others what they already knew, but found satisfaction in repeating them. That if it weren't that Weems was most of the week in London, not a day, not a minute, would she stay in that place. There's the wages, the cook reminded her. Yes, they were good. Higher than anywhere she had heard of. But what was the making of the place was the complete freedom from Monday morning every week to Friday tea time. Almost anything could be put up with from Friday tea time till Monday morning, seeing that the rest of the week could do exactly as they chose, with the whole place as good as belonging to them. And she hurried away and got back to the drawing room 30 seconds overtime. Weems, however, wasn't there with his watch. He was on his way upstairs to the top of the house, telling himself as he went that if Lucy chose to take possession of his library, he would go and take possession of her sitting room. It was only fair. But he knew she wasn't in the library. He knew she wouldn't stay there all that time. He wanted an excuse to himself for going to where she was. She must beg his pardon properly. He could hold out. Oh, he could hold out. All right, for a length of time, as she'd find out very soon if she tried the sulking game with him. But today it was their first day in his home. It was his birthday. And though nothing could be more monstrous than the way she had ruined everything, yet if she begged his pardon properly, she would forgive her. He would forgive her. He was ready to take her back the moment she showed real penitence. Never was a woman loved as he loved Lucy. If only she would be penitent. If only she would properly and sincerely apologize, then he could kiss her again. He would kiss that little shoulder of hers. make her pull her blouse back so that he could see it as he saw it down in the library, sticking out of that damned blanket. God, how he loved her. End of chapter 21. Just upset. Just constantly upset. Lucy. I want Lucy, and maybe she will when she like learns more about Vera, but I want her to see what's happening and I want her to leave. Like, I don't know if that's going to happen. I still absolutely fear for her and maybe even fear for Lizzie. Like, it's interesting that we're also getting like Lizzie's perspective. Perhaps because she's a third party and not in the relationship, sort of like how Aunt Dot was. But we'll see. No less unpleasant after getting a peek into his POV. Yes, yes. Chapter 21. Everyone needs a nap. Just take a nap. We'll all be better when we wake up. We're just a little irritated right now. You want Lucy and Lizzie to be friends accomplices? Yes, I do too. I want them both to get out safely. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's what I want. All right. Chapter 22. We are 62% through. The first thing he saw when he opened the door of the room at the top of the house was the fire. Fire. He hadn't ordered a fire. He must look into that officious slattern Lizzie. Then, before he had recovered from this, he had another shock. Lucy was on the hearthrug, her head leaning against the sofa, sound asleep. There's the nap. There we go. So that's what she had been doing. Just going comfortably to sleep while he shut the door and walked over to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, looking down at her. Even his heavy tread didn't wake her. He had shut the door in the way that was natural and had walked across the room in the way that was natural, for he felt no impulse in the presence of sleep to go softly. Besides, why should she sleep in broad daylight? Weems was of opinion that the night was for that. No wonder she couldn't sleep at night if she did it during the day. There she was, sleeping soundly, completely indifferent to what he might be doing. Would a really loving woman be able to do that? Would a really devoted wife? Then he noticed that her face, the side of it he could see, was much swollen, and her nose was red. At least, he thought, she had had some contrition for what she had done before going to sleep. It was to be hoped she would wake up in a proper frame of mind. If so, even now some of the birthday might be saved. He took out his pipe and filled it slowly, his eyes wandering constantly to the figure on the floor. Fancy that thing having the power to make or mar his happiness. He could pick that much up with one hand. It looked like 12, with its long, stockinged, relaxed legs, and its round, short-haired head, and its swollen face of a child in a scrape. Make or mar. He lit his pipe, repeating the phrase to himself, struck by it, struck by the way it illuminated his position of bondage to love. All his life, he reflected, he had only asked to be allowed to lavish love, to make a wife happy. Look how he had loved Vera, with the utmost devotion till she had killed it, and nothing but trouble was a reward. Look how he loved that little thing on the floor, passionately. And in return, the first thing she did on being brought into his home as his bride was to quarrel and ruin his birthday. She knew how keenly he had looked forward to his birthday. She knew how the arrangements of the whole honeymoon, how the very date of the wedding had hinged on this one day, yet she had deliberately ruined it, and having ruined it, what did she care? Comes up here, if you please, and gets a book and goes comfortably to sleep over it in front of the fire. I am also feeling uneasy. just constant unease. I have not been comfortable once since reading this book. His mouth hardened still more. He pulled the armchair up and sat down noisily in it, his eyes cold with resentment. The book Lucy had been reading had dropped out of her hand when she fell asleep and lay open on the floor at his feet. If she used books in such a way, Weems thought, he would be very careful how he let her have the key of his bookcase. This was one of Vera's. Vera hadn't taken any care of her books either. She was always reading them. He slanted his head sideways to see the title, to see what it was Lucy had considered more worth her attention than her conduct that day towards her husband. Wuthering Heights. He hadn't read it, but he fancied he had heard of it as a morbid story. She might have been better employed, on their first day at home, than in shutting herself away from him reading a morbid story. It was while he was looking at her with those thoughts stonily in his eyes that Lucy, wakened by the smell of his pipe, opened hers. She saw Everard sitting close to her, and had one of those moments of instinctive happiness, of complete restoration to unshadowed contentment, which sometimes followed immediately on waking up, before there had been time to remember. It seems for a wonderful instant as though all in the world were well. Doubts had vanished. Pain is gone, and sometimes the moment continues even beyond remembrance. It did so now with Lucy. Even she opened her eyes and saw Everard. She smiled at him, a smile of perfect confidence. She had forgotten everything. She woke up after a deep sleep and saw him, her dear love, sitting beside her. How natural to be happy. Then, the expression on his face bringing back remembrance, it seemed to her in that first serene sanity, that clear-visioned moment of spirit unfretted by body, that they had been extraordinarily silly, taking everything the other one said and did with tragicness. Only love filled Lucy after the deep, restoring sleep. "Dearest one," she murmured drowsily, smiling at him, without changing her position. He said nothing to that, and presently, having woken up more, she got on her knees and pulled herself across to him and curled up at his feet, her head against his knee. He still said nothing. He waited. He would give her time. Her words had been familiar but not penitent. They had hardly been the right beginning for an expression of contrition, but he would see what she said next. What she said next was, "Haven't we been silly?" And more familiarity. She put one arm round his knee and held them close against her face. "We," said Weems. "Did you say we?" "Yes," said Lucy, her cheek against his knee. "We've been wasting time." Weems paused before he made his comment on this. "Really?" he said. He then said, "The way you include me shows very little appreciation of your conduct." "Well, I've been silly then," she said, lifting her head and smiling up at him. She simply couldn't go on with indignations. Perhaps they were just ones. Just ones. It didn't matter if they were. Who wanted to be in the right in the dispute with one's lover? Everybody, oh, but everybody who loved would passionately want always to have been in the wrong, never to have been right. That one's beloved should have been unkind. Who wanted that to be true? Who wouldn't do anything sooner than have not been mistaken about? Vividly she saw Everard as he was before their marriage. So dear, so boyish, such fun, her playmate. She could say anything to him then. She had been quite fearless, and vividly, too, she saw him as he was when first they met, both crushed by death. How he had comforted her, how he had been everything that was wonderful and tender, all that had happened since, all that had happened on this particular and most unfortunate day, was only a sort of excess of boyishness. Boyishness on that uncontrolled side, a wave, a fit of bad temper provoked by her not having held on to her impulses. That locking her out in the rain, a schoolboy might have done that to any other schoolboy. It meant nothing except that he was angry. About the sexual allure, oh well. I've been very silly, she said earnestly. He looked down at her in silence. He wanted more than that. That wasn't nearly enough. He wanted much more of humbleness before he could bring himself to lift her onto his knee, forgiven. And how much he wanted her on his knee. Do you realize what you've done? He asked. Yes, said Lucy, and I'm so sorry. Won't we kiss and be friends? Not yet, thank you. I must be sure first that you understand how deliberately wicked you've been. Oh, but I haven't been deliberately wicked, exclaimed Lucy, opening her eyes wide with astonishment. Everard, how can you say such a thing? Ah, I see. You are still quite impenitent, and I am sorry I came up. He undid her arm from round his knees, put her on one side, and got out of the chair. Rage swept over him again. Here I've been sitting watching you like a dog, he said, towering over her, like a faithful dog while you slept, waiting patiently till you woke up and only wanting to forgive you, and you not only callously sleep after having behaved outrageously and allowed yourself to exhibit temper before the whole house on our very first day together in my home, well knowing, mind you, what day it is, but when I ask you for some sign, some word, some assurance that you are ashamed of yourself and will not repeat your conduct, you merely deny that you have done anything needing forgiveness. He knocked the ashes out of his pipe, his face twitching with anger, and wished to God he could knock the opposition out of Lucy as easily. She, on the floor, sat up looking at him, her mouth open. What could she do with Everard? She didn't know. Love had no effect. Saying she was sorry had no effect. She pushed her hair nervously behind her ears with both hands. I'm sick of quarrels, she said. So am I, said Weems, going towards the door, thrusting his pipe into his pocket. You've only got yourself to thank for them. She didn't protest. It seemed useless. She said, Forgive me, Everard. Only if you apologize. Yes. Yes, what? He paused for her answer. I do apologize. You admit you've been deliberately wicked? Oh, yes. He continued towards the door. She scrambled to her feet and ran after him. Please don't go, she begged, catching his arm. You know I can't bear it. I can't bear it if we were quarreling. Then what do you mean by saying, oh, yes, in that insolent manner? Did I seem insolent? I didn't mean, oh, I'm so tired of this. I dare say you'll be tireder still before you've done. I don't get tired, let me tell you. You can go on as long as you choose. It won't affect me. Oh, do let's be friends. I don't want to go on. I don't want anything in the world except to be friends. Please kiss me, Everard, and say you forgive me. He, at least, stood still and looked at her. And do believe I'm so sorry. He relented. He wanted extraordinarily to kiss her. I'll accept it if you assure me it is so, he said. And do let's be happy. It's your birthday. As though I've forgotten that. He turned. He looked at her upturned face. Her arm was round his neck now. Lucy, I don't believe you understand my love for you, he said solemnly. No, said Lucy truthfully. I don't think I do. You'll have to learn. Yes, said Lucy, and sighed faintly. You mustn't wound such love. No, said Lucy. Don't let us wound each other ever any more, darling Everard. I'm not talking of each other. I'm talking of this moment of myself in relation to you. One thing at a time, please. Yes, said Lucy. Kiss me, won't you, Everard? Else I shan't know we're really friends. He took her head in his hands and bestowed a solemn kiss of pardon on her brow. She tried to coax him back to cheerfulness. Kiss my eyes, too, she said, smiling at him, or they'll feel neglected. He kissed her eyes. And now my mouth, please, Everard. He kissed her mouth and did at last smile. And now, won't we go to the fire and be cozy? She asked, in her arm in his. By the way, who ordered the fire? He inquired in his ordinary voice. Oh, I don't know. It was lit when I came up. Oughtn't it to have been? Not without orders. It must have been that Lizzie. I'll ring and find out. Oh, don't ring, exclaimed Lucy, catching his hand. She felt she couldn't bear any more ringing. If you do, she'll come, and I want us to be alone together. Well, whose fault is it we haven't been alone together all this time? He asked. Oh, but we're friends now. You mustn't go back to that any more, she said, anxiously smiling and drawing his hand through her arm. He allowed her to lead him to the armchair, and sitting in it did at last feel justified in taking her on his knee. How my own love spoils things, he said, shaking his head at her with fond solemnity when they were settled in the chair. And Lucy, very cautious now, only said gently, but I never mean to. End of 22. She really can't win. And he just expects her to read his mind in exactly the way she's supposed to apologize and the tone of voice she's supposed to use. And yeah. Star, thank you so much for taking care of Lil Bean. He needs it. Have some tea. I just made eye contact with somebody outside my window. Going up on a crane. I'm sure it looks wild. I really should have closed my curtains. It's fine. It's fine. Okay, we're good. Okay, now we can't see each other anymore. All right. Chapter 23. We're 64% through. She sat after that without speaking on his knee, his arms round her, her head on his breast. She was thinking. Try as she might to empty herself of everything except acceptance and love, she found that only her body was controllable. That lay quite passive in Weems's arms, but her mind refused to lie passive. It would think. Strange how tightly one's body could be held, how close to somebody else's heart, and yet one wasn't anywhere near the holder. They locked you up in prisons that way, holding your body tight and thinking they had got you, and all the while your mind, you, was as free as the wind and the sunlight. She couldn't help it. She struggled hard to feel as she had felt when she woke up and saw him sitting near her, but the way he had refused to be friends, the complete absence of any readiness in him to meet her, not half, not even quarter, but a little bit of the way, had for the first time made her consciously afraid of him. Okay, this is significant because a lot of things have made us afraid for Lucy. So this is the first time that she herself has been afraid of him. And I'm sure it's only going to get worse. All right. She was afraid of him, and she was afraid of herself in relation to him. He seemed outside anything of which she had experience. He appeared not to be. He anyhow had not been that day generous. There seemed no way at any point by which one could reach him. What was he really like? How long was it going to take her really to know him? Years? And she herself, she now knew, now that she had made their acquaintance, that she couldn't at all bear scenes. Any scenes, either with herself or in her presence with other people. She couldn't bear them while they were going on, and she couldn't bear the exhaustion of the long, drawn-out making up at the end. And she not only didn't see how they were to be avoided, for no care, no caution would forever be able to watch what she said or did or looked, or equally important, what she didn't say or didn't do or didn't look. But she was afraid with a most dismal foreboding that someday, after one of them, or in the middle of one of them, her nerve would get out and she would collapse. Collapse deplorably into just something that howled and whimpered. This, however, was horrible. She mustn't think like this. Sufficient unto the day, she thought, trying to make herself smile, is the whimpering thereof. Besides, she wouldn't whimper. She wouldn't go to pieces. She would discover a way to manage. Where there was so much love, there must be a way to manage. He had pulled her blouse back and was kissing her shoulder and asking her whose very own wife she was. But what was the good of love-making if it was immediately preceded or followed or interrupted by anger? She was afraid of him. She wasn't in this kissing at all. Perhaps she had been afraid of him unconsciously for a long time. What was that abjectness on the honeymoon? That anxious desire to please, to avoid offending, but fear? It was love afraid of getting hurt, of not going to be able to believe wholeheartedly, of not going to be able, this was the worst, to be proud of its beloved. But now, after her experiences today, she had a fear of him more separate, more definite, distinct from love. Strange to be afraid of him and love him at the same time. Perhaps if she didn't love him, she wouldn't be afraid of him. No, she didn't think she would then, because then nothing that he said would reach her heart. Only she couldn't imagine that. He was her heart. "What are you thinking of?" asked Weems, who had finished with her shoulder, noticed how quiet she was. She could tell him truthfully. A moment sooner and she couldn't have. "I was thinking," she said, "that you are my heart." "Take care of your heart, then, won't you?" said Weems. "We both will," said Lucy. "Of course," said Weems. "That's understood. Why state it?" She was silent a minute. Then she said, "Isn't it nearly tea time?" "By Jove, yes!" he exclaimed, pulling out his watch. "Why, long past. I wonder what that fool— Get up, little love." He brushed her off his lap. "I'll ring and find out what she means by it." Lucy was sorry she had said anything about tea. However, he didn't keep his finger on the bell this time, but rang it normally. Then he stood looking at his watch. She put her arm through his. She longed to say, "Please don't scold her." "Take care," he said, his eyes on his watch. "Don't shake me." She asked what he was doing. "Timing her," he said. "Shh. Don't talk. I can't keep count if you talk." She became breathlessly quiet and expectant. She listened anxiously for the sound of footsteps. She did hope Lizzie would come in time. Lizzie was so nice. It would be dreadful if she got a scolding. Why didn't she come? What was that? A door going somewhere. Would she do it? Would she? Running steps came along the passage outside. Weems put his watch away. 5 seconds to spare, he said. "That's the way to teach them to answer bells," he added with satisfaction. "Did you ring, sir?" inquired Lizzie, opening the door. "Why is tea late?" "It's in the library, sir." "Kindly attend to my question. I asked why tea was late." "It wasn't late to begin with, sir," said Lizzie. "Be so good as to make yourself clear." Lizzie, who had felt quite clear, here became befogged. She did her best, however. "It's got late through waiting to be had, sir," she said. "I'm afraid I don't follow you. Do you?" she asked. He asked, turning to Lucy. She started. "Yes," she said. "Really? Then you are cleverer than I am," said Weems. Lizzie, at this, for she didn't want to make any more trouble for the young lady, made a further effort to explain. "It was punctual in the library, sir, at 4:30, if you'd been there to have it. The tea was punctual, sir, but there wasn't no one to have it." "And pray, by whose orders was it in the library?" "I couldn't say, sir. Chesterton—" "Don't put it on to Chesterton." "I was thinking," said Lizzie, who was more stout-hearted than the parlour-maid, and didn't take cover quite so frequently in dumbness. "I was thinking perhaps Chesterton knew. I don't do the tea, sir." Send Chesterton, said Weems. Lizzie disappeared with the quickness of relief. Lucy, with a nervous little movement, stooped and picked up Wuthering Heights, which was still lying face downward on the floor. Yes, said Weems, I like the way you treat books. She put it back on the shelf. I went to sleep, and it fell down, she said. Everard, she went on quickly, I must go and get a handkerchief. I'll join you in the library. I'm not going to the library. I'm going to have tea here. Why should I have tea in the library? I only thought it was there. I suppose I can have tea where I like in my own house. But of course. Well then, I'll go and get a handkerchief and come back here. You can do that some other time. Don't be so restless. But I want a handkerchief this minute, said Lucy. Nonsense. Here, have mine, said Weems, and anyhow it was too late to escape, for there in the door stood Chesterton. She was the parlour-maid. Her name was not till now had been mentioned. It was Chesterton. Why is the tea in the library? Weems asked. I understood, sir, tea was always to be in the library, said Chesterton. That was while I was by myself. I suppose it wouldn't have occurred to you to inquire whether I still wished it there, now that I am not by myself. This floored Chesterton. Her ignorance of the right answer was complete. She therefore said nothing, and merely stood. But he didn't let her off. Would it? He asked suddenly. No, sir, she said, dimly feeling that yes, sir, would land her in difficulties. No, quite so, it wouldn't. Well, you will now go and fetch that tea and bring it up here. Stop a minute. Stop a minute. Don't be in such a hurry, please. How long has it been made? Since 4:30, sir. Then you will make fresh tea, and you will make fresh toast, and you will cut fresh bread and butter. Yes, sir. And in another time you will have the goodness to ascertain my wishes before taking upon yourself to put the tea into any room you choose to think fit. Yes, sir. She waited. He waved. She went. Hey, long souls. Hello, hello. Thanks for contributing to Sunday's stream. Nudes, he's totally an infant. Absolutely. Little man baby. And I hate it. That'll teach her, said Weems, looking refreshed by the encounter. If she thinks she's going to get out of bringing tea up here by putting it ready somewhere else, she'll find she's mistaken. Aren't they a set? Aren't they a set, my love? I don't know, said Lucy nervously. You don't know? I mean, I don't know them yet. How can I know them when I've only just come? You soon will, then. A lazier set of careless, lying. Do tell me what that picture is, Everard, she interrupted quickly, crossing the room and standing in front of it. I've been wondering and wondering. You can see what it is. It's a picture. Yes, but where's the place? I've no idea. It's one of Vera's. She didn't condescend to explain it. You mean she painted it? I dare say. She was always painting. Weems, who had been filling his pipe, lit it and stood smoking in front of the fire, occasionally looking at his watch, while Lucy stared at the picture. Lovely, lovely to run through the door, out into the open, into the warmth and sunshine, further and further away. It was the only picture in the room. Indeed, the room was oddly bare, a thin room with no carpet on its slippery floor, only some infrequent rugs, and no curtains. But there had been curtains, for there were the rods with rings on them, so that somebody must have taken Vera's curtains away. Lucy had been strangely perturbed when she noticed this. It was Vera's rooms. Her curtains oughtn't to have been touched. The long wall opposite the fireplace had nothing at all on its sand-colored surface from the door to the window except a tall, narrow looking-glass in an oddly carved black frame into the picture. But how that one picture glowed! What glorious weather they were having in it! It wasn't anywhere in England, she was sure. It was a brilliant, sunlit place, with a lot of almond trees in full blossom, an orchard of them, apparently, standing in grass that was full of little flowers. Very odd, those little flowers, of kinds she didn't know, And through the open door in the wall, there was an amazing stretch of hot, vivid country. It stretched on and on till it melted into an ever so far away lovely blue. There was an effect of immense spaciousness, a huge freedom. One could feel oneself running out into it with one's face to the sun, flinging up one's arms in an ecstasy of release, of escape. It's somewhere abroad, she said after a silence. I dare say, said Weems. You to travel much? She asked, still examining the picture, fascinated. She refused to. She refused to, echoed Lucy, turning round. She looked at him wonderingly. That seemed not only unkind of Vera, but extraordinarily, yes, energetic. The exertion required for refusing Everard something he wanted was surely enormous, was surely greater than any but the most robust-minded wife could embark upon. She had had one small experience of what disappointing him meant in that question of Christmas, and she hadn't been living with him then, and she had had all the nights to recover in. Yet the effect of that one experience had been to make her give in at once when the next he wanted something, and it was because of last Christmas that she was standing married in that room instead of being still, as both she and her Aunt Dot had intended, 6 months off it. Why did she refuse? She asked, wondering. Weems didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, I was going to say you had better ask her, but you can't very well do that, can you? Lucy stood looking at him. Yes, she said. She does seem extraordinarily near, doesn't she? This room is full— Now, Lucy, I'll have none of that. Come here. He held out his hand. She crossed over obediently and took it. He pulled her close and ruffled her hair. He was in high spirits again. His encounters with the servants had exhilarated him. Who's my what? I don't know what this means. Doodle Dudley Umpty? What? Is this a silly nickname that he's come up with her? Who's my Dudley Umpty little girl? He asked. Tell me who's my Dudley Umpty little girl. Quick, tell me. And he caught her round the waist and jumped her up and down. Chesterton, bringing in the tea, arrived in the middle of a jump. End of 23. It seems like the more we read, the what? The more we read, the farther into a cave Lucy is walking, and the opening is like closing and closing and getting smaller and smaller. I I don't understand this nickname. Dudley Umpty. I do not want to be called that. Is that like a cute name? Does Weems thinks that does Weems think that's cute? Because it's not. It's just silly. This truly feels like a mentally scarred person. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Chapter 24. Movie in education. I have not. You wonder if he was like this before. I think so. This is what I was thinking when we saw that she was reading one of Vera's books, that Vera would be like writing in the margins, like what actually happened. Because like he said that he doesn't read he said that he doesn't really read his books, but he mentioned that he doesn't read any of her books. So I'm wondering, yeah, if Lucy is going to come across some margin notes. Similar deal, age gap. Okay, okay. But she's in gross. So we'll see. Well, and it seems like the to point to, like, if he was like this before, it seems like the other, like, people who are working in the house, like, they're not surprised by his reactions. And so I do think that he's just like this. Pre Vera's death. Yeah. All right. Chapter 24. We are 67% into this. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's just heightened. That could be. I don't know. Mm. There appeared to be no tea table. Chesterton, her arms stretched taut, holding the heavy tray, looked round. Evidently tea up there wasn't usual. Put it in the window, said Weems, jerking his head towards the writing table. Oh, began Lucy quickly and stopped. What's the matter? Asked Weems. Won't it be drafty? Nonsense. Drafty. You suppose I'd tolerate windows in my house that let in drafts? Chesterton, resting a corner of the tray on the table, was sweeping a clear space for it with her hand. Not that much sweeping was needed, for the table was big, and all that was on it was the note paper which earlier in the afternoon had been scattered on the floor, a rusty pen or two, some pencils whose ends had been gnawed as the pencils of a child at its lessons were gnawed, a neglected-looking ink-pot, and a grey book with household accounts in dark lettering on its cover. Weems watched her while she arranged the tea things. Take care now. Take care, he said, when a cup rattled in its saucer. Chesterton, who had been taking care, took more of it, and, oh my gosh, le trop being l'ennemi du bien, she was so unfortunate as to catch her cuff in the edge of the plate of bread and butter. The plate tilted up. The bread and butter slid off, and only by a practiced, quick movement did she stop the plate from following the bread and butter and smashing itself on the floor. There now, said Weems. See what you've done? Didn't I tell you to be careful? It isn't, he said, turning to Lucy, as if I hadn't told her to be careful. Chesterton, on her knees, was picking up the bread and butter which lay, a habit she had observed in bread and butter under circumstances of this kind, butter downwards. Any time you drop bread and butter, it is always butter downwards. Always. I love the inclusion of that detail. You will fetch a cloth, said Weems. Yes, sir. And you will cut more bread and butter. Yes, sir. That makes 2 plates of bread and butter wasted today, entirely owing to your carelessness. They shall be stopped out of your... Lucy, where are you going? To fetch a handkerchief. I must have a handkerchief, Everard. I can't forever use yours. You'll be doing nothing of the kind. Lizzie will bring you one. Come back at once. I won't have you running in and out of the room the whole time. I never knew anyone so restless. Ring the bell and tell Lizzie to get you one. What is she for? I should like to know. He then resumed and concluded his observations to Chesterton. They shall be stopped out of your wages. That, he said, will teach you. And Chesterton, who was used to this, had long ago arranged with the cook that such stoppages should be added on to the butcher's book, said, Yes, sir. When she had gone, or rather withdrawn, for a plain word like gone doesn't justly describe the noiseless decorum with which Chesterton managed the doors of her entrances and exits, and when Lizzie, too, had gone after bringing a handkerchief, Lucy supposed they would now have tea. She supposed the moment had at last arrived for her to go and sit in that window. The table was at right angles to it, so that sitting at it you had nothing between one side of you and the great pane of glass that reached nearly to the floor. You could look sheer down on to the flags below. She thought it horrible. Gruesome to have tea there, and the very first day before she had had a moment's time to get used to things. Such detachment on the part of Everard was either just stark wonderful, she had already found noble explanations for it, or it was so callous that she had no explanation for it at all. None, that is, that she dared think of. Once more she decided that his way was really the best and simplest way to meet the situation. You took the bull by the horns. You seized the nettle. You cleared the air. And though her images, she felt, were not what they might be, neither was anything else that day what it might be. Everything appeared to reflect the confusion produced by Weems's excessive lucidity of speech. "Shall I pour out the tea?" she asked presently, preparing then to take the bull by the horns, for he remained standing in front of the fire smoking in silence. "Just think," she went on, making an effort to be happy. "This is the first time I shall pour out tea in my—" She was going to say, "my new home," but the words wouldn't come off her tongue. Weems had repeatedly during the day spoken of his home, but not once had he ever said our or your. And if ever a house didn't feel as if it in the very least belonged to her, it was this one. "Not yet," he said briefly. She wondered. "Not yet?" she repeated. "I'm waiting for the bread and butter." "But won't the tea get cold?" "No doubt, and it'll be entirely that fool's fault." "But—" began Lucy after a silence. "Buts again." "I was only thinking that if we had it now, it wouldn't be cold." She must be taught her lesson. Again she wondered. "Won't it rather be a lesson for us?" she asked. "For God's sake, Lucy, don't argue. Things have to be done properly in my house. You've had no experience of a properly managed household. All that set you were brought up in, why, one only had to look at them to see what a hugger-mugger way they probably lived. I have no idea what that means. A hugger-mugger? Okay, here we go. Confused, disorderly, a spirit of careless frivolity. That's fun. That's a fun one. It's entirely the careless fool's own fault that the tea will be cold. I didn't ask her to throw the bread and butter on the floor, did I? And as she said nothing, he asked again, "Did I?" he said. "No," said Lucy. "Well then," said Weems. They waited in silence. Chesterton arrived. She put the fresh bread and butter on the table, and then wiped the floor with a cloth she had brought. Weems watched her closely. When she had done, and Chesterton, being good at her work, scrutinize as he might, he could see no sign of the floor of overlooked butter. He said, "You will now take the teapot down and bring some hot tea." "Yes, sir," said Chesterton, removing the teapot. A line of a hymn her nurse used to sing came into Lucy's head when she saw the teapot going. It was, "What various hindrances we meet." And she thought the next line, which she didn't remember, must have been, "Before at tea ourselves we seat." But though one portion of her mind was repeating this with nervous levity, the other was full of concern for the number of journeys up and down all those stairs the parlor-maid was being obliged to make. It was, well, thoughtless of Everard to make her go up and down so often. Probably he didn't realize, of course he didn't, how very many stairs there were. When and how could she talk to him about things like that? When would he be in such a mood that she would be able to do so without making them worse? And how, in what words sufficiently tactfully, excuse me, and how, in what words sufficiently tactful, sufficiently gentle, would she be able to avoid his being offended? She must manage somehow. "Come on, Lucy, push him out the window. Do it!" But tact, management, prudence, all these she had not yet in her life needed. Had she the smallest natural gift for them? Besides, Each of them applied to love seemed to her an insult. She had supposed that love, real love, needed none of these protections. She had thought it was a simple, sturdy growth that could stand anything. Why, here was the parlor maid already, teapot and all. How very quick she had been. Chesterton, however, hadn't so much been quick as tactful, managing, and prudent. She had been practicing these qualities on the other side of the door, whither she had taken the teapot and quietly waited with it a few minutes, and whence she now brought it back. She placed it on the table with admirable composure, and when Weems, on her politely asking whether there were anything else he required, said, "Yes, you will now take away that toast and bring fresh," she took the toast, also, only as far as the other side of the door, and waited with it there a little. Lucy now hoped they would have tea. "Shall I pour it out?" she asked after a moment, a little anxiously, for he didn't move, and she began to be afraid the toast might be going to be the next hindrance, in which case they would go round and round for the rest of the day, never catching up the tea at all. Also, that is so smart of Chesterton to just wait on the other side of the door an appropriate amount of time and bring back the same thing. Yeah, like that is genius. I love it. Good on you, Chesterton. Now, if we can only get Lucy to push him out the door, or push him out the window. Alright. But he did go over and sit down at the table, followed by her, who hardly now noticed its position, so much surprised and absorbed was she by his methods of housekeeping. "Isn't it monstrous," he said, sitting down heavily, "how we've been kept waiting for such a simple thing as tea? I tell you, they're the most slovenly—" There was Chesterton again, bearing the toast rack balanced on the tip of a respectful ringer. This time even Lucy realized that it must be the same toast, and her hand, lifted in the act of pouring out tea, trembled, for she feared the explosion that was bound to come. How extraordinary. There was no explosion. Everard hadn't, it seemed incredible, noticed. His attention was so much fixed on what she was doing with his cup. He was watching her so carefully lest she should fill it a hair's breadth fuller than he liked, that all he said to Chesterton as she put the toast on the table was, "Let this be a lesson to you." And there was no gusto in it. It was quite mechanical. "Yes, sir," said Chesterton. She waited. She knows he's a man-child. Yeah. He waved. She went. The door hadn't been shut an instant before Weems exclaimed, "What if that slovenly hussy hasn't forgotten—" And too much incensed to continue, he stared at the tea tray. "What? What?" asked Lucy, startled, also staring at the tea tray. "Why, the sugar." "Oh, I'll call her back. She's only just gone—" "Sit down, Lucy." "But she's just outside—" "Sit down, I tell you." Lucy sat. Then she remembered that neither she nor Everard ever had sugar in their tea, so naturally there was no point in calling Chesterton back. "Oh, of course," she said, smiling nervously, for what with one thing and another she was feeling shattered. "How stupid of me. We don't want sugar." Weems said nothing. He was studying his watch, timing Chesterton. Then when the number of seconds needed to reach the kitchen had run out, he got up and rang the bell. In due course, Lizzie appeared. It seemed that the rule was that this particular bell should be answered by Lizzie. "Chesterton," said Weems. In due course, Chesterton appeared. She was less composed than when she brought back the teapot, than when she brought back the toast. She tried to hide it, but she was out of breath. "Yes, sir," she said. Weems took no notice and went on drinking his tea. Chesterton stood. After a period of silence, Lucy thought that perhaps it was expected of her, as mistress of the house, to tell her about the sugar. But then they neither of them wanted any. After a further period of silence, during which she anxiously debated whether it was this that they were all waiting for, she thought that perhaps Everard hadn't heard the parlor maid come in, so she said, she was ashamed to hear how timidly it came out, "Uh, Chesterton is here, Everard." He took no notice, and went on eating bread and butter. After a further period of anxious inward debate, she concluded that it must, after all, be expected of her, as mistress of the house, to talk of the sugar, and the sugar was to be talked of not because they needed it, but on principle. But what a roundabout way! How fatiguing and difficult! Why didn't Everard say what he wanted instead of leaving her to guess? "I think," she stammered, flushing, for she was now very timid indeed, "you've forgotten the sugar, Chesterton?" "Will you not interfere?" exclaimed Weems very loud, putting down his cup with a bang. The flush on Lucy's face vanished as if it had been knocked out. If you ever decide to be horrible, start taking notes. Definitely a new level. Yes, yes, yes. You had me at the first half, yeah. Me too. Me too, Falcor. She sat quite still. If she moved or looked anywhere but at her plate, she knew she would begin to cry. The scenes she had dreaded had not included any with herself in the presence of servants. It hadn't entered her head that these, too, were possible. She must hold on to herself, not move, not look. She sat absorbed in that one necessity, fiercely concentrated. Chesterton must have gone away and come back again, for presently she was aware that sugar was being put on the tea tray, and then she was aware that Everard was holding out his cup. "Give me some more tea, please," he said, "and for God's sake don't sulk. If the servants forget their duties, it's neither your nor my business to tell them what they've forgotten. They've just got to look and see, and if they don't see, they've just got to stand there, looking, till they do. It's the only way to teach them. But for you to get sulking on the top of it—" She lifted the teapot with both hands, because one hand by itself too obviously shook. She succeeded in pouring out the tea without spilling it, and in stopping almost at the very moment when he said, take care, you're filling it too full." She even succeeded after a minute or two in saying, holding carefully onto her voice to keep it steady, "I'm not sulking. I've I've got a headache." And she thought desperately, the only thing to be done with marriage is to let it wash over one. End of chapter 24. Everard is a monster. An absolute monster. Like, okay, so the sugar situation. Neither of them drink with sugar. So, of course, Chesterton doesn't put sugar on the tea tray, knowing their preferences, which is a good sign of somebody who works for you. Like, you know the preferences. You did a good job. Hurrah. And then calling Chesterton back, and the expectation is for her to just stand there to figure out what is missing. When, of course, there's nothing missing. And then when Lucy, like, interrupts or thinks that as the mistress, she's supposed to be the one to say this, and maybe this is just training that Everard is trying to get her into, is yelled at. Terrible. Terrible. If she had included sugar from the beginning, yes, Weems would have scolded her for wasting sugar. Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no winning situation in tea today. Absolutely. No. No. The only thing missing is this jerk's humanity. We would be waiting a long time for that. Yeah, no. Oh man. There's just no winning. This was a lose-lose situation from the beginning. Like what a power trip to be on. I don't understand it. at all. At all. But I'm also not terrible to other people, so you know. Okay, your theory is that Weems was always a control freak. Vera kept that in check, and now he's getting his dream situation. Ooh. Okay, I got chills when I read dream situation. The help does not seem, yes, to these extremes, yes. Mm-hmm. Yep, yep, yep. Yeah, like he was probably terrible for a while, but I think you're totally right. I think Vera probably did keep it in check. Interesting, interesting. At least the way that you're reading it, yeah. All right. Chapter 25. We are 71% in. We think. Yeah, 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 yeah. We think. Which I really do hope. And like, where did the curtains go? So obviously Vera put them up because there was a comment when we were looking at all of the windows that Weems hates curtains because then you can't look outside. So are the curtains like evidence that that Vera's death was more nefarious? I don't know. He was obviously terrible to her too. Yeah. Maybe. Mhm. That could absolutely be. You think it's evidence for how he's always been on a power trip? Yeah. Does he not know how to draw the curtains back to, Star, you would think. You would think. They're not that heavy. You can move them. And they just look nice. You can just have them open and it makes a room look nice. I don't understand. It's a good question, though. But I'm sure he would not like to be asked that question. Do you not know that you can open the curtains and look outside? Well, I'll have you ask Star. I'm not gonna ask. All right. Chapter 25. For the rest of that day, she let it wash, unresistingly. She couldn't think anymore. She couldn't feel anymore. Not that day. You wouldn't be friends? What? She really had a headache. And when the dusk came and Weems turned on the lights, it was evident even to him that she had, for there was no color at all in her face and her eyes were puffed and leaden. He had one of his sudden changes. Come here, he said, reaching out and drawing her onto his knee, and he held her face against his breast and felt full of maternal instincts and crooned over her. Was it a poor little baby? He crooned. Did it have a headache then? And he put his great cool hand on her hot forehead and kept it there. Again, using it to describe Lucy, terrible, terrible. He would be the type who agrees with no dancing allowed in town like Footloose. Unless it was a dance just for him on his birthday. And if you messed it up, there will be hell to pay. Synchronized dance on one day of the year. Lucy gave up trying to understand anything at all anymore. These swift changes, she couldn't keep up with them. She was tired. Tired. They sat like that in the chair before the fire, Weems holding his hand on her forehead and feeling full of maternal instincts, and she in unresisting blank, till he suddenly remembered he hadn't shown her the drawing room yet. The afternoon had not proceeded on the lines laid down for it in his plans, but if they were quick, there was still time for the drawing room before dinner. Accordingly, she was abruptly lifted off his knee. Come along, little love, he said briskly. Come along. Wake up. I want to show you something. And the next thing she knew was that she was going downstairs, and presently she found herself standing in a big, cold room, blinking in the bright lights she had switched on at the door. This, he said, holding her by the arm, is the drawing room. Isn't it a fine room? And he explained the piano, and told her how he had found a button off, and he pointed out the roll of rugs in a distant corner, which, unrolled, decorated the parquet floor, and he drew her attention to the curtains. He had no objection to curtains in a drawing room, he said, because a drawing room was anyhow a room of concessions, and he asked her at the end, as he had asked her at the beginning, if she didn't think it a fine room. Okay, so you can only have curtains in this one specific room. Everywhere else, terrible idea. Totally throws off the vibe. This was all on the first day. They have not had dinner yet. They have not gone to sleep yet. This is a terrible first day. I was wondering that too, Noodles. A drawing room is a room of concessions. Yeah. I was also wondering if this is just going to be into one day, and if it is, I'm terrified to see how the end of the day is. And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. This is yes. Yes. Lucy said it was a very fine room. You'll remember to put the cover on properly when you've finished playing the piano, won't you? He said. Yes, I will, said Lucy. Only I don't play, she added, remembering she didn't. That's all right, then, he said, relieved. They were still standing admiring the proportions of the room, its marble fireplace, and the brilliancy of its lights. The test of good lighting, said Weems, is that there shouldn't be a corner of a room in which a man of 80 can read his newspaper. When the gong began. Good Lord, he said, looking at his watch. It'll be dinner in 10 minutes. Why, we've had nothing at all of the afternoon, and I'd planned to show you so many things. Ah, he said, turning and shaking his head at her, his voice changing to sorrow. Whose fault has that been? Mine, said Lucy. I'm so angry right now. He put his hand under her chin and lifted her face, gazing at it and shaking his head slowly. The light, streaming into her swollen eyes, hurt them and made her blink. Ah, my Lucy, he said fondly. Little waster of happiness. Isn't it better simply to love your Everard than make him unhappy? Much better, said Lucy, blinking. There was no dressing for dinner at the Willows, for that, explained Weems, was the great joy of home, that you needn't ever do anything you don't want to in it, and therefore, he said, 10 minutes' warning was ample for just washing one's hands. It is extremely gross, yes. Also, 10 minutes is just enough time to wash your hands. How are you washing your hands? Why is it taking you close to 10 minutes? I don't understand. I don't understand. Well, I guess it is like a big place. I'm guessing you have to like wash your hands and then walk a great distance to get to the dining room. Exactly. That's what I was thinking, Wadsworth. You're just scrubbing for 10 minutes straight. Dirty. Oh, that could be where washing your hands is just, yeah, the way that women used powder their nose back then. That could be just to like freshen up a little bit, for sure. Instead of like completely changing your clothes or outfit or anything like that. It's like, all right, compose yourself, wash your hands, little monster, and then we'll have dinner. Yeah, that makes sense. They washed their hands together in the big bedroom, because Weems disapproved of dressing rooms at home even more strongly than on honeymoons in hotels. Nobody's going to separate me from my own woman, he said, drying his hands and eyeing her with proud possessiveness while she dried hers. Their basins stood side by side on the brown mottled marble of the washstand. Are they? He said, as he dried in silence. No, said Lucy. How's the head? He asked. Better, she said. Who's got a forgiving husband? He said. I have, she said. Smile at me, he said. She smiled at him. At dinner, it was Vera who smiled, her changeless little strangled smile, with her eyes on Lucy. Lucy's seat had its back to Vera, but she knew she had only to turn her head to see her eyes fixed on her, smiling. No one else smiled. Only Vera. Lucy bent her head over her plate, trying to escape the unshaded light that beat down on her eyes, sore with crying and hurt. In front of her was the bowl of king cups, the birthday flowers. Just behind Weems stood Chesterton, in an attitude of strained attention. Dimly through Lucy's head floated thoughts. Seeing that Everard invariably spent his birthday at the Willows, on that day last year, at that hour, Vera was sitting where she, Lucy, now was, with the king cups glistening in front of her, and Everard tucking his table napkin into his waistcoat, and Chesterton waiting till he was quite ready to take the cover off the soup. Just as Lucy was seeing these things this year, Vera saw them last year. Vera still had 3 months of life ahead of her then. 3 more months of dinners and Chesterton and Everard tucking in his napkin. How odd. What a dream it all was. On that last of his birthdays, at which Vera would be present, did any thought of his next birthday cross her mind? How strange it would have seemed to her if she could have seen ahead and seen her, Lucy, sitting in her chair. The same chair. Everything just the same, except the wife. She ate her soup, sitting all crooked with fatigue. Life was exactly like a dream. Weems, absorbed in the scrutiny of his food and the behavior of Chesterton, had no time to notice anything Lucy might be doing. It was the rule that Chesterton, at meals, should not for an instant leave the room. The furthest she was allowed was a door in the dark corner opposite the door into the hall, through which at intervals Lizzie's arm thrust dishes. It was the rule that Lizzie shouldn't come into the room, but, stationary on the other side of this door, her function was to thrust dishes through it. And to her, from the kitchen, pattering ceaselessly to and fro, came the tweeny bringing of dishes. This had all been thought out and arranged very carefully years ago by Weems, and ought to have worked without a hitch. But sometimes there were hitches, and Lizzie's arm was a minute late thrusting in a dish. When this happened, Chesterton kept waiting, and conscious of Weems enormously waiting on the end of the table, would put her head round the door and hiss at Lizzie, who then hurried to the kitchen and hissed at the tweeny, who, for her part, didn't dare hiss at the cook. Tonight, however, nothing happened that was not perfect. From the way Chesterton had behaved about the tea and the way Lizzie had behaved about the window, Weems could see that during his 4 weeks' absence his household had been getting out of hand, and he was therefore more watchful than ever, determined to pass nothing over. On this occasion he watched in vain. Things went smoothly from start to finish. The tweeny ran, Lizzie thrust, Chesterton deposited, dead on time. Every dish was hot and punctual, or cold and punctual, according to what was expected of it. And Weems, going out of the dining room at the end, holding Lucy by the arm, couldn't but feel he had dined very well. Perhaps, though, his father's photograph hadn't been dusted, it would be just like them to have disregarded his instructions. He went back to look, and Lucy, since he was holding her by the arm, went too. No, they had even done that, and there was nothing further to be said, except, with great sternness to Chesterton, eyeing her threateningly, "Coffee, at once." The evening was spent in the library reading Weems's school reports and looking at photographs of him in various stages, naked and crowning, with ringlets in a frock, in knickerbockers, holding a hoop, a stout schoolboy, a tall and slender youth, thickening, still thickening, thick, and they went to bed at 10 o'clock. Somewhere around midnight, Lucy discovered that the distance of the treble bed softened sound. Either that, or she was too tired to hear anything, for she dropped out of consciousness with the heaviness of a released stone. Okay, more than one day. Next day, it was finer. There were gleams of sun, and though the wind still blew, the rain held off except for occasional spatterings. They got up very late. Breakfast on Sundays at the Willows was not till 11, and went and inspected the chickens. By the time they had done that and walked round the garden and stood on the edge of the river throwing sticks into it and watching the pace at which they were whirled away on its muddy and disturbed surface, it was luncheon time. After luncheon, they walked along the towpath, one behind the other because it was narrow and the grass at the sides was wet. Weems walked slowly, and the wind was cold. Lucy kept close at his heels, seeking shelter under, as it were, his lee. Talk wasn't possible because of the narrow path and the blustering wind, but every now and then Weems looked down over his shoulder at her. "Still there?" he asked, and Lucy said she was. They had tea punctually at 4:30 up in Vera's bedroom, but without, this time, a fire. Weems had rectified Lizzie's tendency to be officious, and after tea he took her out again to show her how his electricity was made, while the gardener, who saw to the machinery, and the boy, who saw to the gardener, stood by in attendance. There was a cold sunset, a narrow strip of gold below heavy clouds, like a sullen, half-open eye. The prudent cows dotted the fields motionlessly, lying on their dry bite of grass. The wind blew straight across from the sunset through Lucy's coat, wrap herself in it as tightly as she might, while they loitered among outhouses and examined the durability of the railings. Her headache, in spite of her good night, hadn't gone, and by dinner time her throat felt sore. She had nothing. She said nothing to Weems, because she was sure she would be well in the morning. Her colds never lasted. Besides, she knew, for he had often told her, how much he was bored by the sick. At dinner her cheeks were very red, and her eyes very bright. "Who's my pretty little girl?" said Weems, struck by her. Indeed, he was altogether pleased with her. She had been his own Lucy throughout the day, so gentle and sweet, and hadn't once said but, or tried to go out of rooms. Unquestioningly acquiescent she had been, and now so pretty, with the light full on her, showing up her lovely coloring. "Who's my pretty little girl?" he said again, laying his hand on hers while Chesterton looked down her nose. You can't with the baby talk. Yeah, it is really gross, especially since he's like double her age. So I have a theory. Okay. So Weems loves when Lucy is acquiescent, doesn't really talk, doesn't really do anything that he doesn't want her to do. And he's clearly doting on her right now and just loves that she is very docile because she doesn't feel well. So I'm wondering if this is a situation where Weems is going to continue making her sick and reliant on him for support. I don't know. I'm scared. That's what I know. I'm scared and I want Lucy to leave. And turned on my brightness just ever so slightly. There we go. Yeah. Yeah. Because he also made a comment about like her coloring, and her cheeks are like flushed because she doesn't feel well, and her nose is like a little red because she doesn't feel well. You're having more Crimson Peak flashbacks. Yes. All right. What's up, toxic relationship fans? Hey, Captain Hardship. Hello. Happy Thursday. How are you? Okay. Then he noticed she had a knitted scarf round her shoulders, and he said, "Whatever have you got that thing on in here for?" "I'm cold," said Lucy. "Cold? Nonsense. You're as warm as a toast. Feel my hand compared to yours." Then she did tell him she thought she had caught cold, and he said, withdrawing his hand and his face falling, "Why, if you have, it's only what you deserve when you recollect what you did yesterday." Okay, not what I thought was going to happen. That theory is, my theory is gone now. "I suppose it is," agreed Lucy, and assured him her colds were all over in 24 hours. Afterwards, in the library when they were alone, she asked if she hadn't better sleep by herself in case he caught her cold, but Weems wouldn't hear of such a thing. Not only, he said, he never caught colds and didn't believe anyone else who was sensible ever did. It's not how colds work, okay? But it would take more than a cold to separate him from his wife. Besides, though of course she richly discovered a cold after yesterday, "Who's a shameless little baggage," he said, pinching her ear, "coming down with only a blanket on?" Somehow, though he had been so angry at the time, the recollection of that pleased him. He could see no signs of her having got one. She didn't sneeze. She didn't blow her nose. Lucy agreed and said she didn't suppose it was anything really, and she was sure she would be all right in the morning. Okay, it's definitely not a cold. You also don't get a fever with a cold. Yes. I don't want to use the word anti-vaxxer. That's not how sicknesses work. Weems. "Yes. And you know we catch the early train up," said Weems. "Leave here at 9 sharp, mind." "Yes," said Lucy. And presently, for she was feeling very uncomfortable and hot and cold in turns, and had a great longing to creep away and be alone for a little while, she said that perhaps, although she knew it was very early, she had better go to bed. "All right," said Weems, getting up briskly. "I'll come too." Just let her be. Just let her be. I If she wants her own bed when she's sick, give her her own bed when she's sick. So controlling. Yeah, just be more sensible and then you won't get sick. Duh. Lucy. Terrible. All right. We have time for one more chapter. Oh. Let's do it. All right, chapter 26. Actually, let's see how many chapters there are total. Okay, there's 32 total. That's cool. So we'll probably finish on Tuesday. Yeah, cool. We'll finish on Tuesday. That's fun. I have to wonder why Weems and Vera didn't have kids. That is interesting. But it's probably good that they didn't. Yes. Do you have the spirit for one more chapter? Do you have the spirit for one more chapter? Is the actual question. Oh, Falcor. You're totally right. Can you imagine if the baby was getting more attention than Weems? Oh, I looked outside and there's the person on the lift is out there. Which is funny because it's very dark here right now and it is also raining. I'm sure they think I'm crazy. That's fine. It's fine. Next time I'll close the Next time I'll close the curtains because apparently you can have them both open and closed. according to Star. All right, chapter 26. He found her, however, very trying that night, the way she would keep on turning round, and it reached such a pitch of discomfort to sleep with her, or rather endeavor to sleep with her, for as the night went on, she paid less and less attention to his requests that she should keep still. That it was about 2 o'clock. Staggering with sleepiness, he got up and went into a spare room, trailing the quilt after him and carrying his pillows, and finished the night in peace. Chicago question. What, to you, is the greater Chicagoland area? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say, yes, I do. I do know. Lots of people say that they're in Chicago when they're not in Chicago. Or they say that they're in a suburb of Chicago when they're like hours away from Chicago. The greater Chicagoland area. I mean, I would say Chicago proper. And then I would include like the first layer of suburbs, like the next one. Not any further. Like if you're an hour 45 minutes away, you are not part of the greater Chicagoland, even though that's what people say. You're not. But for traveling purposes, I totally get why people say Chicago. Because nobody's gonna know, like, I don't know, Oak Park, Evanston, like, nobody's gonna know those. Chicagoland, yeah. If you are. Oh, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in, welcome in. Yeah, Chicagoland is like, if you're not actually in Chicago, you would say Chicagoland. Like Chicagoland Radio or something like that, because it, like, also includes, like, the surrounding areas of Chicago. The problem with measuring by time is driving in Chicago. Yes, but you also can't say distance in Chicago. So you can't say, like, oh, it's 3 miles away, because those 3 miles are probably going to take you like 20 ish minutes, maybe more, probably more, depending on where you are. 3 Chicago miles, 45 anywhere else miles at time. Yes. Mhm. You gotta really want to go where you're going. Which is why, like, or at least partly why, like, neighborhoods are so, like, have such different feels, because people don't necessarily travel outside of their neighborhood all that much unless you're going to, like, a specific place. But if you're just, like, exploring food or entertainment or whatever, you can probably find it in your own neighborhood. All right, let's see. Weems, throwing a fit, left to sleep in his own bed. When he woke at 7, he couldn't make out at first where he was, nor why. On stretching out his arms, he found no wife to be gathered in. Then he remembered, and he felt most injured, that he should have been turned out of his own bed. If Lucy imagined she was going to be allowed to develop the same restlessness at night that was characteristic of her by day, she was mistaken, and he got up to go and tell her so. He found her asleep in a very untidy position, the clothes all dragged over to her side of the bed and pulled up round her. He pulled them back again, and she woke up, and he got up into bed and said, "Come here," stretching out his arms, and she didn't come. Then he looked at her more closely, and she, looking at him with heavy eyes, said something husky. It was evident she had a very tiresome cold. "What an untruth you told me," he exclaimed, "about not having a cold in the morning." She said again something husky. It was evident she had a very tiresome, sore throat. "It's getting on for 7:30, said Weems. "We've got to leave the house at 9 sharp, mind." Was it possible that she wouldn't leave the house at 9 sharp? The thought that she wouldn't was too exasperating to consider. He go up to London alone? On this, the first occasion of going up after his marriage? He be alone in Lancaster Gate, just as if he hadn't a wife at all? What was the good of a wife if she didn't go up to London with him? And all this to come upon him because of her conduct on his birthday. "Well," he said, sitting up in bed and looking down at her, "I hope you're pleased with the result of your behavior." But it was no use saying things to somebody who merely made husky noises. He got out of bed and jerked up the blinds. "Such a beautiful day, too," he said indignantly. When at 9:15 the station cab arrived, he went up to the bedroom, hoping that he would find her after all dressed and sensible and ready to go. But there she was, just as he had left her when he went to have his breakfast, dozing and inert in the tumbled bed. "You'd better follow me by the afternoon train," he said, after staring down at her in silence. "I'll tell the cab. But in any case," he said, as she didn't answer, "in any case, Lucy, I expect you tomorrow." She opened her eyes and looked at him languidly. Never once mentioned Vera's birthday. New strategy. Okay. Stop using words and just start making raspy throat sounds whenever Weems talks. Perfect. "Do you hear?" he said. She made a husky noise. "Goodbye," he said shortly, stooping and giving the top of her head a brief, disgusted kiss. The way the consequences of folly fell always on somebody else and punished him. Weems could hardly give his Times the proper attention in the train for thinking of it. That day, Miss Entwistle, aware of the return from the honeymoon on that Friday, and of the weekend to be spent at the Willows, and of the coming out at Lancaster Gate early on the Monday morning for the inside of the week, waited till 12 o'clock, so as to allow plenty of time for Weems no longer to be in the house, and then telephoned. Lucy and she were to lunch together. Lucy had written to say so, and Miss Entwistle wanted to know if she wouldn't soon be round. She longed extraordinarily to fold that darling little child in her arms again. It seemed an eternity since she saw her radiantly disappearing in the taxi, and the letters she had hoped to get during the honeymoon hadn't been letters at all, but picture postcards. A man's voice answered her, not Weems's. It was, she recognized, the voice of the pale servant who with his wife attended the Lancaster gatehouse. They inhabited the basement, and emerged from it up into the light only if they were obliged. Bells obliged them to emerge, and Weems's bath and breakfast, and after his departure to his office, the making of his bed. But then the shades gathered round them again till next morning, because for a long while now, once he had left the house, he hadn't come back till after they were in bed. His remarriage was going to disturb them, they were afraid, and the pale wife had forebodings about meals to be cooked. But at the worst, the disturbance would only be for the 3 inside days of the week, and anything could be borne when one had from Friday to Monday to oneself. And as the mornings went on, and no one arrived from Strorley, they began to take heart, and had almost quite taken it when the telephone bell rang. It didn't do it very often, for Weems had his other address, at the office, at the club, so that Twite, wanting in practice, was not very good at dealing with it. Also the shrill bell vibrating through the empty house, so insistent, so living, never failed to agitate both Twites. It seemed to them uncanny, and Mrs. Twite, watching Twite being drawn up by it out of his shadows, like some quiet fish sucked irresistibly up to gasp on the surface, was each time thankful that she hadn't been born a man. She always went and listened at the bottom of the kitchen stairs, not knowing what mightn't happen to Dwight up there alone with that voice, and on this occasion she heard the following. "No, ma'am. Not yet, ma'am. I couldn't say, ma'am. No. No news, ma'am. Oh, yes, ma'am, on Friday night. Yes, ma'am, first thing Saturday. Yes, it is, ma'am. Very strange, ma'am." And then there was silence. He was writing, she knew, on the pad provided by Weems for the purpose. This was the most trying part of Twight's duties. Any message that had to be written down and left on the hall table, complete with the time of its delivery, for Weems to see when he came in at night. Twight was not a facile writer. Words confused him. He was never sure how they were spelt. Also, he found it very difficult to remember what had been said, for there was a hurry and an urgency about a voice on a telephone that excited him and prevented his giving the message his undivided attention. Besides, when was a message not a message? Weems's orders were to write down messages. Suppose they weren't messages. Must he still write? Was this, for instance, a message? He thought he had best be on the safe side and laboriously wrote it down. "Miss Henwissel rang up, sir, to know if you was come, and if so, when you was coming, and what orders we 'ad, and said it was very strange." 12:15. He had only just put this on the table and was about to descend to his quiet shades when off the thing started again. This time, it was Weems. "Back tonight late as usual," he said. "Yes, sir," said Dwight. "There's been a—" But he addressed emptiness. Meanwhile, Miss Entwistle, after a period of reflection, was ringing up Strawarly 19. The voice of Chesterton, composed and efficient, replied, and the effect of her replies was to make Miss Entwistle countermand lunch and pack a small bag and go to Paddington. Trains to Strawarly at that hour were infrequent and slow, and it wasn't till nearly 5 that she drove down the oozy lane in the station cab and, turning in at the white gate, arrived at the Willows. That sooner or later she would have to arrive at the Willows now that she was related to it by marriage was certain, and she had quite made up her mind, during her 4 weeks' peace since the wedding, that she was going to dismiss all foolish prejudices against the place from her mind and arrive at it, when she did arrive, with a stout heart and an unclouded countenance. After all, there was much in that mot of her nephew's, "Somebody has died everywhere." Yet, as the cab heaved her nearer to the place along the oozy lane, she did wish it wasn't in just this house that Lucy lay in bed. Also, she had misgivings at being there uninvited. In the case of serious illness, naturally such misgivings wouldn't exist, but the maid's voice on the telephone had only said Mrs. Weems had a cold and was staying in bed, and Mr. Weems had gone up to London by the usual train. It couldn't be much that was wrong, or he wouldn't have gone. Hadn't she? She thought uneasily as she found herself uninvited within Weems's gate, perhaps been a little impulsive? Yet the idea of that child alone in the sinister house. She peered out of the cab window. Not at all sinister, she said, correcting herself severely. Almost neat. Perfect order. Shrubs, as they should be. Strong railings. Nice cows. The cab stopped. Chesterton came down the steps and opened its doors. Nice parlor maid. Most normal. "How is Mrs. Weems?" asked Miss Entwistle. "About the same, I believe, ma'am," said Chesterton, and inquired if she should pay the man. Miss Entwistle paid the man, and then proceeded up the steps, followed by Chesterton carrying her bag. Fine steps. Handsome house. "Does she know I'm coming?" "I believe the housemaid did mention it, ma'am." Nice roomy hall, with a fire. It might be quite warm. Fine windows. Good staircase. "Do you wish for tea, ma'am?" "No, thank you. I should like to go up at once, if I may." "If you please, ma'am." At the turn of the stairs where the gong was, Miss Entwistle stood aside and let Chesterton precede her. Perhaps you had better go and tell Mrs. Weems I am here, she said. If you please, ma'am. Miss Entwistle waited, gazing at the gong with the same benevolence she had brought to bear on everything else. Fine gong. She also gazed at the antlers on the wall, for the wall continued to bristle with antlers right up to the top of the house. Magnificent collection. If you please, ma'am, said Chesterton, reappearing, tiptoeing gingerly to the head of the stairs. Miss Entwistle went up. Chesterton ushered her into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Miss Entwistle knew Lucy was small, but not how small till she saw her in the treble bed. There really did appear to be nothing of her except a little round head. "Why, but you've shrunk!" was her first exclamation. Lucy, who was tucked up to her chin by Lizzie, besides having a wet bandage encased in flannel round her throat, could only move her eyes and smile. She was on the side of the bed farthest from the door, and Miss Entwistle had to walk around it to reach her. She was still hoarse, but not as voiceless as when Weems left in the morning, for Lizzie had been diligently plying her with things like hot honey, and her face, and her eyes followed Miss Entwistle's approach, was one immense smile. It really seemed too wonderful to be with Aunt Dot again, and there was a peace about being ill, a relaxation from strain that had made her quiet day, alone in bed, seem sheer bliss. It was so plain that she couldn't move, that she couldn't do anything, couldn't get up and go in trains, that her conscience was at rest in regard to Everard, and she lay in the blessed silence after he left, not minding how much her limbs ached because of the delicious tranquility of her mind. The window was open, and in the garden the birds were busy. The wind had dropped. Except for the birds there was no sound. Divine quiet. Divine peace. The luxury of it after the weekend, after the birthday, after the honeymoon was extraordinary. Just to be in bed by oneself seemed an amazingly felicitous condition. "Lovely of you to come," she said, hoarsely, smiling broadly and looking so unmistakably contented that Miss Entwistle, as she bent over her and kissed her hot forehead, thought, "It's a success. He's making her happy." "You darling little thing," she said, smoothing back her hair. "Fancy seeing you again like this." "Yes," said Lucy, heavy-eyed and smiling. "Lovely," she whispered, "to see you. Tea, Aunt Dot?" It was evidently difficult for her to speak, and her forehead was extremely hot. "No, I don't want tea." "You'll stay?" "Yes," said Miss Entwistle, sitting down by the pillow and continuing to smooth back her hair. "Of course I'll stay. How did you manage to catch such a cold, I wonder?" She was left to wonder, undisturbed by any explanations of Lucy's. Indeed, it was as much as Lucy could manage to bring out the most necessary words. She lay contentedly with her eyes shut, having her hair stroked back, and said as little as possible. "Everard?" said Miss Entwistle, stroking gently. "Is he coming back tonight?" "No," whispered Lucy contentedly. Aunt Dot stroked in silence. "Has your temperature been taken?" she asked presently. "No," whispered Lucy contentedly. "Oughtn't you—" after another pause, "to see a doctor?" "No," whispered Lucy contentedly. Delicious, simply delicious, to lie like that, having one's hair stroked back by Aunt Dot, the dear, the kind, the comprehensible. "So sweet of you to come," she whispered again. Well, thought Miss Entwistle, as she sat there softly stroking and watching Lucy's face of complete content, while she dozed off even after she was asleep, the corners of her mouth still were tucked up in a smile. It was plain that Everard was making the child happy about that. In that case, he certainly must be all that Lucy had assured her he was, and she, Miss Entwistle, would no doubt very quickly now get fond of him. Of course she would. No doubt whatever. And what a comfort, what a relief to find the child happy. Backgrounds didn't matter where there was happiness. James, thank you so much for the follow. Hello, hi, welcome in. Houses, indeed. What did it matter if they weren't the sort of houses you would, left to yourself, choose so long as in them dwelt happiness? What did it matter what their past had been so long as their present was illuminated by contentment? And as for furniture, why, that only became of interest, of importance, when life had nothing else in it. Loveless lives, empty lives, filled themselves in their despair with beautiful furniture. If you were really happy, you had antlers. In this spirit, while she stroked and Lucy slept, Miss Entwistle's eyes, full of benevolence, wandered round the room. The objects in it, after her own small bed in Eaton Terrace had its necessarily small furniture, all seemed to her gigantic. Especially the bed. She had never seen a bed like it before, though she had heard of such beds in history. Didn't Og, the king of Bashan, have one? But what an excellent plan, for then you could get away from each other. Most sensible, most wholesome. And a certain bleakness about the room would soon go when Lucy's little things got more strewn about, her books and photographs and pretty dressing table silver. Miss Entwistle's eyes arrived at and dwelt on the dressing table. On it were two oval, wooden-backed brushes without handles. Hairbrushes. Men's. Also shaving things. And, hanging over one side of the looking-glass, were 3 neckties. She quickly recovered. Most friendly. Most companionable. But a feeling of not being in Lucy's room at all took possession of her, and she fidgeted a little. With no business to be there whatever, she was in a strange man's bedroom. She averted her eyes from Weems's toilet arrangements. They were the last things she wanted to see, and, in averting them, they fell on the washstand with its 2 basins, and on an enormous red-brown india-rubber sponge. And no such sponge was ever Lucy's. The conclusion was forced upon her that Lucy and Everard washed side by side. From this, too, she presently recovered. After all, marriage was marriage, and you did things in marriage that you would never dream of doing single. She averted her eyes from the washstand. The last thing she wanted to do was to become familiar with Weems's sponge. Same. Her eyes, growing more and more determined in their benevolence, gazed out of the window. How the days were lengthening. And really a beautiful lookout, with the late afternoon light reflected on the hills across the river. Birds, too, twittering in the garden. Everything most pleasant and complete. And such a nice, big window. Lots of air and light. It reached nearly to the floor. 2 housemaids at least, and strong ones, would be needed to open or shut it, and no, there were cords. The thought struck her. This couldn't be the room. That couldn't be the window where... She averted her eyes from the window and fixed them on what seemed to be the only satisfactory resting place for them, the contented face on the pillow. Dear, little, loved face, and the dear, pretty hair. How pretty young hair was, so soft and thick. No, of course it wasn't the window. That tragic room was probably not used at all now. How in the world had the child got such a cold? She could hear by her breathing that her chest was stuffed up, but evidently it wasn't worrying her, or she wouldn't, in her sleep, look so much pleased. Yes, that room was either shut up now or never used, or... She couldn't help being struck by yet another thought. It was a spare room. If so, Miss Entwistle said to herself, it would no doubt be her fate to sleep in it. Dear me, she thought, taken aback. But from this also she presently recovered, and something her determination to eject all prejudices merely remarked to herself, well, well, and after a pause was able to add benevolently, a house of varied interest. End of the chapter. Okay, well, I'm glad that Aunt Dot is back. Um, I'm also worried that Aunt Dot is back. Like, I'm glad that she's there and going to take care of Lucy. It is, of course, understandable that she's confusing Lucy's happiness and contentedness. You know the word I'm trying to say. Um, on the fact that it is all due to Weems, where it's like, no, it's because you're here and she's finally at peace and is finally like not suffocated by somebody constantly needing to be around her or around him rather. Why do I have the feeling Weems is gonna lose it? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, he's gonna lose it, and that I worry, but he's gonna be gone for a couple days. Maybe they'll run away. Maybe they will. I don't know. I don't know. We'll have to see because who can tell where the road goes? Only time. You know? We'll see. Um, yeah, we'll see. That'll be something that we find out on Tuesday. So yeah, the that's gonna be where we end tonight. We are 77% in. According to my reading speed, we have 2 hours and 15 minutes. So he'll know though because that creepy pale servant took a message. Oh, you're right. But the name was wrong.